Okay, folks, we've reached the hour, so we're going to get started. This next speaker is Graham Strickert. I'll be introducing myself. No, so what I'm going to try to do over the next 3 hours is do a life by PowerPoint. And I'm going to talk about the Delta over the last 10 years and some things that Tim Jardine and myself have learned working with many, many others. Could we get the slides up there? And then the show. Do I do that here? There, we're winning. All right, so we're going to go over lessons learned and what's kind of emerging as a Delta collaboratorium. There's a whole bunch of people that have been working on this over the last 10 years. And I want to do this as a kind of call to action. So if any of you are interested in this work, you know, the door's open to collaborate with us because it's such a big challenge that we can't do it alone. And there's already probably 30 people that are working on this place. But if you have any interest in this, please reach out to myself or Tim or any of the people that we mentioned during this talk. So first, I'd like to say that land-based experience, artistic expression, and traditional knowledge has had a huge impact in communicating knowledge about the Delta over the last 10 years. And here are some examples. This first one, you can't see that. The drawing there is by a Cree artist named Michelle Paul. And on the back side of this drawing, which we distributed to kids in schools, was a policy brief about how to operate reservoirs. We also did a mixed media art installation that was toured from Saskatoon to Yellowknife, which saw 6,000 different people viewing it. And then down below, we have a sand table that was so successful during the Delta display tour that we actually had to send kids home at the end of the night because they just wouldn't leave. They were having so much fun with it. This one down in the bottom was converting the flows of the river into sound, and it sounded like a heartbeat. So the heart of the Delta has been changed as a result of those upstream reservoirs. And we also did a course called Becoming Water, which was culminated in a film that was featured at 8 international film festivals. But nevertheless, there's been frustration with lack of tangible progress. People from the communities around the Delta, they want action. And the benchmark success has to be the wildlife, the insects, the fish, the birds, the mammals, and humans' health. And why is this important? Well, it's North America's largest freshwater delta. There's a bit of a battle whether the piece is bigger, but we'll figure that out later. It's designated as an important bird area. It's also Saskatchewan's oldest European settlement, established in 1774. And there's livelihoods, culture, and language, the Swampy Cree language, which is dependent on the health of this area. So the goals here is to provide some lessons learned over the last 10 years. And in summary, the 20th century wasn't kind to the Delta. Industrial abstraction of water, irrigation abstraction mainly, impact of water resource management from hydro reservoirs, as well as cities have all had a cumulative impact. And there's really multiple stressors. Some of them are regional in nature and some of them are local in nature, but there's very much interactions between them. So the bottom left chart is, you can see right about here, that's where the dams come in. So in the 60s, dams were built on the system, and you can see that the fluctuation of water in the Delta gets squished around that lower bound, and that has a big impact. You can also see the pre-dam hydrograph compared to the post-dam hydrograph, which is really tough for the wildlife in the system because they're all adapted to what was happening in the pre-dam situation rather than the post-dam. And then finally, the local impacts are more from hydropeaking. So ramping up reservoirs in order to produce electricity. And hydropeaking causes stress for people as well as wildlife. So here you can see people, trying to get their boat off the bank because the water has dropped about a meter. There's also impacts to fish. So on the left photo, those little stick-looking things are actually fish that have been stranded in a river channel about 15 kilometers from E.B. Campbell Dam. And you can see the water really low here at Big Eddy, which is a site that's been inhabited by Indigenous people for a long time. And it's not just low water, high water can also be a problem. So here we have flooding and community evacuations. Interestingly enough, in 2011, which was one of the highest water levels on record, the community did not evacuate. And so we're trying to find the right balance. But there's also a big impact in the ramping rate, which I'll come back to later. But human-made floods put animals at risk. So these figures show the different levels of water extent in dry conditions in a small but a very dynamic part of the delta known as the avulsion belt. And it's about 1,300 square kilometers. A critical discovery from Tim Jardine, Brett McKinnon, and Jay Sagan, with support from Gary Carrier, Solomon Carrier, and others, is that the wetlands that connect to the river the least often are the least productive. And so the less connected the wetlands are to the river, the less life that they can support. And you see, it's a little bit like a heart. When the wetlands lack oxygen and nutrients, the wetlands become stagnant and they die. And locals describe the wetlands as being stinky, which is sulfur and methane and other things from rotting materials in the delta. And fish in these wetlands die. So if we were to intervene in what's going on, where do we begin? Well, here's a photograph, of the old channel and the dragline channel. And what's going on here is that there's water coming in from the Saskatchewan River into the old channel. This is the old Saskatchewan River. But it's not going past this site of the dragline. And the dragline a few years ago was blocked and there was no water flowing in there, which affects an area of about 6,000 square kilometers, known as the Cumberland Marshes. And so we're seeing these perched channels that are no longer getting water, and then highway-sized areas that lack biological productivity because they're being perched. But also the seasons really matter. And here's an example of a really good year in 1921, and here's an example of a really bad year. And what makes this a bad year is that there's two peaks. And so the animals, they start to do their thing when they get the first peak, but then they get a second peak once they've established nests or they've moved into an area for spawning, and then they get wiped out from the second peak. And so they're not used to that. But another issue is that sediment gets trapped at Lake Diefenbaker and caught at Reservoir in Tobin Lake. And restoring the sediment regime is probably just as important as restoring the natural flows. And wave action on Cumberland Lake in the bottom photo actually stirs up the sediment, and then the sediment gets pulled out of there. But at the same time, the outlet from Cumberland Lake is getting wider and deeper, and very little flow reaches the Taring River, which is a critical spawning ground. But there's also much bigger impacts on the system upstream. So E.B. Campbell is a problem, but it's not the only problem. We have the storage on Lake Diefenbaker. Here's the current level of irrigation compared to future plans for irrigation. But there's even more going on upstream, particularly for irrigation in Alberta. So there are many users upstream who don't know the delta's there. If they knew, would they change their minds? Well, the wildlife really hope so. And duck density has declined significantly since 1960. Muskrat populations have pretty much collapsed. Moose populations have gone way, way down. It's not just bad for wildlife, but it's also bad for humans. And Phragmites, which is an invasive grass, is also taking over in parts of the delta, particularly around Cumberland Lake. And this brings us to the human dimensions. All of these things that impact wildlife also impact humans. Several years ago, we had a project called the Delta Dialog Network. And this was the diagram on the left was the network at the very beginning of the project. And then the diagram on the right was the network at the end of the project. And this is something you could do for your own project. Figure out who's connected to who and how it changes over time, which can be very, very instructive. You notice here that the density of connections among people working on the deltas got way, way more dense, which is a good thing. But doing nothing no longer seems like a reasonable option. And many agencies want to do something because they know that all of these impacts affect every part of people's lives and their identity. And the many agencies who want to help out, such as all these groups, but they don't necessarily know what to do. They know they want to improve the Delta, but how and where and whether we're tackling regional problems or local problems is of a central interest. And I really need to put a shout out to Haley Carlson, Layla Balke, Carl-Eric Linden Schmidt, and Saman Razabi for helping build what's known as the Delta Dialog Group, who are a bunch of government agencies who are working on tackling the challenges of the Delta that's just happened in the last 3 years with much more collaboration. But back to the local scale, what we've heard is people want to let people upstream know that we are here, not just humans, but many animals that depend on this place. We want to know that we've been heard, and we want to see action that restores life in the Delta. And this is coming from the community members. And what they say is that we need to influence upstream decision makers, bring back nature's flows and restore the Delta's rhythms, clear debris jams to expand wildlife habitat, reduce the ramping rate to eliminate hydropeaking, restore sediment regimes from Lake Diefenbaker to the Delta, examine weirs and where they can make a difference, bring back fire as a restorative tool, and do a full species inventory of the Delta. Now, we've started tackling some of these things. Here is a decision support tool that's been developed by IMPC, in particular, a shout out to Anna Picha Duplessis and Carl Gutwin, Saman Razavi, and Tim Jardine, and Carl-Eric Linden Schmidt. This has been developed in partnership with SAS Power, who actually provided the operations of E.B. Campbell Dam, which is an extremely sensitive data set that they were willing to share with us so that we can create a visualization tool to ask some of those really difficult questions and have those conversations that we haven't been able to have and try to break down some of those myths that we all hold about how the system operates. The collaboration is having an impact. For example, I'll just let you read this quote. This is just from 2 years ago. I'll just give you a second to read that. This was a significant moment for us. We never know, are we being successful or are we actually having an impact? But what this was a signal was that the decision makers were actually responding to the users downstream. And it's a small thing, but it's a significant victory. And we also have messages such as bring back nature's flows, restore the Delta's rhythms. This would be a message for the Water Security Agency to try and bring closer together the pre-dam situation to the post-dam. So trying to renaturalize the flow. Oops. We've also had locals doing a lot of work to reconnect channels by digging out, cutting up lumber. You can see the debris jam in the bottom left, and some of the folks from N90 trappers, N28 trappers, and the Cumberland Fishermen's Co-op actually clearing channels, trying to bring them back as habitat for fish. But what if we had two channels like the diagram on the left? Which one do we protect? And so we don't quite know that yet. Which one is going to give us the most biological productivity in terms of bringing it back online? And there are other places where they've used actual digging equipment to try and open those channels so that they become part of the river. There's many more things happening, but I'm out of time for today. So I'll just leave it there. If you're interested, there's a few more things that we are trying to do in partnership with people like Ducks Unlimited, the restoration project in the Cumberland Marshes, sediment restoration, reducing the ramping rate by using battery storage at the dam, sediment restoration all the way from Lake Diefenbaker to the Delta, bringing back fire as a restorative tool. This is a really important story. Renee Carrier and her daughter, Michaela, worked with some of their students to create a book called Muskrat Fire, which was distributed to every single school in Saskatchewan, including those on reserve. So I'll leave it there. And thanks so much for your time. And I'm convening the next session, so would like to invite Lee Wilson. And if you heard what Monica was saying today about the importance of communicating your work, pay close attention to how Will delivers this, because he's one of the most exceptional speakers I've seen here. You can grab your presentation down there. Okay.
Is there a clicker for this? Yeah, great, thanks. Okay, well, thank you for the nice introduction. I'm pretty sure that anything I would say would be disappointing, given that nice introduction. So, but it's a pleasure for me to be here today. And I just want to tell a little bit of a brief story about some of the recent work that we've done. I think I better just leave that there. And basically, our group's been working on different aspects of adsorbent technology, mostly to address, I would say, anything from inorganic contaminants to organic contaminants like the oil sands. But I'll talk mostly about inorganics today. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention some of the members of the group. So I'll show you their picture first of all. And then maybe I'll just take you through a quick story of some of the work that we've been doing. So our group is sort of focused on looking at biopolymers, naturally occurring materials, and taking them and transforming them to try to improve their properties, mostly from the viewpoint of environmental remediation. And so that's why I put a star next to water treatment here. But you can see that there's a number of other areas that we've been working in, and some of that was actually discussed this morning. Yuri talked a little bit about some of the sensors that he's developed, and then Bernd has also been working as well in water treatment. And so, so you can see that it's an interesting area that's growing. It's probably not as well established as synthetic polymers, but what is quite interesting about biopolymers is they're not well understood. And so I'll try to illustrate some of that pretty much near the end of the talk. And so a lot of what we're doing is focused on adsorption processes, which are arguably the simplest type of process that you can work with. And I show it here in this frame. And basically, it's considered as a relatively benign process. In terms of treatment, that would be, because you're not really adding a lot of chemicals. In fact, it might be a net zero in terms of what you input. What I should point out is that the adsorbents that we design are solid phase. So basically water would flow through these materials. They can be recovered and you can regenerate the materials and recover the contaminants. And so that's sort of the short story, but my focus was really to talk a bit about ions. That could be cations or anion species. And they tend to be quite difficult to capture. And part of the idea behind that, or the understanding to it, really sort of focuses on thermodynamics, which I'm not going to get into, but they're very, very soluble in water, generally speaking. So they're very hard to separate from water. And that's sort of the underlying idea. But what we've been working on is how to engineer or manipulate these biopolymers to make them very, very attractive and with very high affinity towards different ions, negatively charged, positively charged, organic or inorganic, but I'll focus mostly on the inorganic species here. But one of the challenges with adsorbents, and many of you know this already, is it's pretty hard to generate an adsorbent that has high affinity and selectivity, very high fidelity. And so that's something that is sort of a big goal, long-term goal for us. And so I've arbitrarily sort of divided the three areas that categories of materials that we've worked with in terms of a type 1, a type 2, and type 3. So the very simplest one is type 1, and we basically just chemically modify the functional groups of a biopolymer. We could switch it from hydrophobic to hydrophilic just by changing functional groups. That seems to work pretty well, but it seems to have limits. When we work with type 2 systems, we cross-link them. with various types of materials. They could be small cross-linkers or large. And then the third type is sort of a hybrid of type 2 and type 1. And that's really a composite material. And this is kind of where some of the excitement lies, which I'll try to show near the end of this presentation. And a composite material is basically a combination of 2 or more components, and it tends to have behavior that is quite unlike each of the individual components that make it up. And so if I just focus on one kind of biomaterial that's sort of been interesting, and it might actually be interesting for one of these stories that was talked about earlier. It's a material that's derived from crustaceans or mushrooms or different other types of sources, but crustaceans is a major source. And this material is called chitin. It's a natural biopolymer, and you can change it to a deacetylated form. I'm not going to get into the chemistry on this, but what it allows you to do is to make a whole series of different types of materials, fibers, beads, films. The sky is kind of the limit on what this material can do. So let me just show you some examples. So one of the tools that we've developed is a probe method for mapping a material. And this is the so-called dye adsorption method. And what it is I'm showing you a dye in the top left-hand side. It can be a different chemical species depending on the pH that you're working at, alkaline versus acidic. And what you find is that you can see spectral signatures that are very characteristic of the acid or the base forms. And what you would find is that if you adsorb this dye, you can see the color change in the vials. So you either absorb a lot or you adsorb very little. And using that equation here, the change in the concentration of the dye tells you what's being adsorbed. And so that doesn't sound very exciting, but I'll just show you some data where you can really learn a lot about a material which is very difficult to access otherwise. And so this is a material that was made by a student of mine about almost 10 years ago. And it's a combination of the main component in baby diapers, which is polyacrylic acid. And we combine it with this chitosan material. And it forms a kind of a messy looking hybrid system on the right. And what we found was that this is a very interesting material for capturing textile dyes or pesticides of various types. And on the very left-hand side, we're sort of at ambient pH, and we just have pure dye. And the second vial from the left, we add in a little bit of the powder that I just showed you on the previous slide. And you'll notice that over time, all of that dye will disappear. It gets all absorbed at the bottom of the tube. But if I take the pH and I switch it down to very acidic pH, I can release that dye. And so we can go through a cyclic process where we capture, release, capture, and release. And this can happen over and over again. And it's kind of shown as well on the right-hand side here. And this is very interesting because you have a chemical signal that you can turn this material on and off. So you can capture, release, capture, release. It's really quite interesting. Simple, but still very interesting. And so we've built upon this idea, and we were pretty fortunate in 2013, I guess it was. We got a Grand Challenge Canada grant to basically solve a problem which is a big problem. So the Biosand filter, and a lot of you know about this, it's actually used in about 75 countries across the world for producing potable water. The problem with the Biosand filter is it doesn't take contaminants down that are 5 parts per million or below. And so we recognized this and decided that we would build an add-on, a cartridge, onto the end of the spout. I don't even know how to work the pointer on this, but there's a spout on the end of the Biosand filter. And we just basically attach our cartridge on there. It's a biomaterial, and it can capture all kinds of pesticides. And those pesticides are shown here. Some of them are quite oil soluble, some of them are quite water soluble. But what you'll notice is that on this graph, that's the native biomaterial just right off the shelf. But these are the transformed materials here, and you can tune those materials in a controllable way, such that you can dial in and basically take out any kind of pesticide that you want out of solution. So it's really kind of a cool system. And it was a project that was done in Kenya on the Athi River. And so if we turn our attention away from pesticides and sort of harmful organics, we come back to some of the inorganic materials such as phosphate, and that's a big focus of GIWS for some of the research groups. We've taken chitosan and cross-linked it as a type 2 material, and we found that we can tune the material in much the same way as the previous example, so that we can take more or less phosphate out, whether it's an organo or an inorganic phosphate. And you can see the different colors of the materials. Here we're actually synthesizing beads as opposed to powders. Powders has been sort of the main thing that we've been looking at for quite some time. So the very last thing I want to show you is this kind of interesting example. We've come up with this sort of a type 3 material. It's a composite, and it's basically can be made in single step or 2-step processes. It's a modular design. You can basically take a biopolymer, add a component, make it into a gel, extrude it into an industrial extruder, make these pellets, and these can be used as an adsorbent, and they're actually quite interesting. And so what we looked at was addressing the sulfate issue in Saskatchewan, because it's actually quite severe, as you know. Some aquifers are thousands of parts per million, but it's toxic above 500 parts per million for young livestock. And so we were able to show at the bench that we can design quite tunable materials that will take sulfate out pretty in a versatile way. And so we've taken this a little step further thanks to our engineering friends, and basically show the proof of concept in a flowing system. And what we could achieve in the lab, sort of under normal sort of controlled batch conditions, we can basically get in a flow system. And we can get very good removal of sulfate at virtually no cost in terms of the synthesis of the material. So the very last thing I wanted to talk about was an interesting project, and it builds on this whole biocomposite material. Some of you know about Flint, Michigan in the US, where they had this real crisis back in 2013-14. The lead levels were 1,000 times higher than what the EPA recommends. People were having lots of health problems, like you can't imagine. I won't go into the details of the story, but someone blew the whistle in 2019 on Regina and Saskatoon, and we had levels that were triple of the Government of Canada regulations, or the Sask Health regulations. And so I thought, well, this is maybe a nice, interesting testing ground for our materials to see, can we remove lead using this interesting strategy that we developed? And so basically what we did is we made a biopolymer, 3 components. You mix them, you extrude them, dry them, and use them. It's really very simple. It doesn't get simpler than that in terms of synthesis. And what you can see with the red line is that's the 3-component composite. The original material is the black line. So there's a huge jump. And it's a non-linear jump when you start changing the relative concentrations of these materials. And the winner is a material that contains oat hulls, which is a waste product from agriculture. And it can take out lead very, very efficiently. And so this became the subject of this paper that appeared in Frontiers in February. And the question was, what the heck is going on? Because it's a complicated system. And thanks to Bernd, who spoke this morning, he was around for the sort of the tail end of this project. And we finished off what we feel is sort of the explanation behind it. And so this is what you see here. And it's really some of the natural components in the biopolymer. And they have this very high affinity to lead. So the details are probably not that important here. But what is important is that this is a green chemistry approach. It's quite different than anything else that we've ever done. And it's a sustainable material. Anybody in a developing country could do this. And it's pretty robust and versatile. So this is just by way of conclusion. We have been working in this area for a while, but we've developed different strategies to basically remediate different types of pollutants in a controlled way. Everything from organic to inorganic. And so more recently, we've been looking at cartridges. and in a very much boots on the ground and an applied way of how this can be actually taken to the field. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity to work together. I know there's people working on phosphate in the room, and there's some engineers in the room, et cetera. And so I just want to thank some of the people that supported our research, particularly GIWS. Thanks to Jay and Fanny, because they've always been very supportive from the very beginning. And thank you for your attention.
Nope, you got 1 minute for a question. If anyone has a question for Will? Sorry, Lee Wilson? Okay, well, I'll ask a question if no one else does. You mentioned that you've created a technique for removing pesticides, and I wonder if that technique would work with glyphosate.
That's a good question. So we haven't actually tested glyphosate yet, but that's something that was on the radar. So if that's something that we'd like to work on, why don't we talk? So but I think it should work. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lee. And now we're going to welcome Carl Eric Linden Schmidt. Some of our community partners in Cumberland House and other places know Carl as the Iceman.
So thank you, everybody. I notice we have quite a spectrum, a broad spectrum of research foci. So I decided to make my presentation a little bit more pedagogical than theoretical or technical. So we'll see at the end how successful I've been. Anyways, I'm going to go a little bit through some ice jam formation, how that occurs, and also a stochastic modeling approach that I developed with my team to look at or to calculate ice jam flood hazard and risk, and also used for forecasting. So this is an ice jam. The flow of the river is from top to bottom, and you can see here at the bottom, that's the intact ice cover from the midwinter, from throughout winter. And you can see that there's an accumulation of ice blocks upstream of that that accumulate at the edge of the intact ice cover and cause backwater staging and flooding. And you can see some of the floodplains up in the top there that are flooding from that ice jam. So just to maybe for a reference, I'm comparing this to an open water case. So this is open water. So it's quite straightforward. For a certain water flow in the river, you're going to get a certain water level. And if you increase that flow, then your water level increases too. And you can graph that. Yes. And again, to form what you call a rating curve, quite common concept. But this is not the case for ice-induced flooding. In the case of ice, let's say now here's our intact ice cover from the winter. Upstream of that has been broken up, and the flow is from left to right. And we get now ice blocks coming down and accumulating and getting caught here. And you can see that it's thickening. It's a bit thicker than your ice cover. And that thickness causes a bit of a constriction underneath it, and your water level will increase. Yeah, there we go. And then you have more ice coming down, And now that ice jam becomes thicker, and it's also longer. You get more resistance to flow. And even though it might be the same flow, you're still going to get an increase in your water level. Yeah, here again as well. Now, what's interesting with ice jams, and that's what makes it chaotic in behavior, is that if I just, this toe, this is the ice jam toe, if that were just to slip down just a little bit downstream, you can get a totally different morphology of your ice jam. You'll have the same volume of ice, same flow, but you now, in this case here, you had a drop in your water level. So it's very hard to predict and to do any type of a relationship, sometimes an empirical relationship. Yeah. With ice jam, so that you can see here, so it doesn't follow, a nice curve like an open water rating curve. The best you can do is sort of define an envelope of those water level elevations to your flow. Yeah, and this is here an example you can see from a gauge at Fort McMurray, the open water flow rating curve at the bottom, but you can see how high your water levels become, the water level on the left axis, on the y-axis, how high they become. And even for very low discharges, you can get very high water levels. Yeah. So in order to tackle this chaotic nature, we've developed this stochastic modeling approach. And if I go back here, if I just gathered all the discharge values here on the x-axis and make a histogram of that, you can see you're going to get more of a peak of that histogram in the lower discharges, but you're going to get some extreme values in the higher discharges, and you can plot that nicely. Here's a histogram, of that, the flow and the frequency. So I made frequent histograms and not frequency distributions to make it a little easier to understand. I also told you too that the toe of the jam, which can have a big influence on your morphology and your backwater dynamics, your morphology of the jam, somewhere along that x direction can change, and you can also make a distribution of that. It's a bit of a stepped uniform distribution because some reaches can have more jamming than others. The parameters to the model generally are uniform, so they have equal probability of being chosen. And another thing that we've extended the method as well is that there can be a tendency for lower flows to have lower volumes of ice, and with larger flows, more ice. Yeah, and I looked at this with some of the events that I modeled. The x-axis is flow, and as you increase the flow, your volume of ice increases. There's quite a bit of scatter, but there is a bit of a relationship there, and that's also put into this framework, So now what I do for one simulation, I'll pick randomly a value from each of those histograms, and I'll do a simulation. That's my first simulation. That's the river bottom, and that's the water level profile, my backwater level profile. I'm not showing the ice, just the water level. Now for the second simulation, randomly pick from each distribution a value. Do another simulation number 2. Do the same for simulation number 3. And then do hundreds of them. And you get an ensemble of backwater levels. And you can now put in some statistical measures, like the 1 in 100 is the 99th percentile, or I guess the first percentile from the top, yeah. Or the 1 in 50 is the 2%, or from the bottom, the 98th percent, yeah. And you can now, to calibrate this system, you can compare it to observed data, yeah. So this is from a gauge, and then we also have readings from the Clearwater mouth, which gives me just a nice spillover in number 3 to the study site. So here we're at the Athabasca, the flow is to the north. I have the upstream boundary and downstream boundary of the mall, it's about 55 kilometers. The orange dots are my gauging stations. So I've got a gauge here and then the Clearwater mouth. And what generally happens, the ice comes down the Athabasca River and jams in here, just downstream of the Clearwater mouth. And the backwater goes up the Clearwater and floods downtown Fort McMurray. So that's generally what happens. So I'm just going to take, I did this, I'm just going to take a window of this and I'm getting a very nice calibration. Yeah, I got my percentiles, which is a summary of my ensembles, and they're matching very nicely to the return periods for from my observed data. So for the 1 in 100 year flood, that's the middle one here. I'll take that water level and extrapolate that into downtown Fort McMurray, and I can get my flood depths, yeah, and my flood extent, yeah. Now, what's interesting for the local government authorities there, the regional municipality of Wood Buffalo, is what can we do to mitigate this, yeah? Well, one way is either a dike. I'm not going to show the dike. I'm going to actually go into artificial breakage. You have these machines called amphibexes, and this is before the spring breakup. You can artificially break up the ice cover so that you would do it in this area here. So theoretically, when that ice comes down, it wouldn't lodge in that area between those two gauging sites. It would just pass through and lodge in that area, yeah? And that would reduce the backwater into Fort McMurray, yeah? So how do you do that? Yeah, for these scenarios, we work with our input distributions again, yeah? So what we do is our X here, the second from the top left, we would refine that. So we would cut out any locations where you could have a jam toe. And you noticed here, this is the original one, the percentiles, they just dropped a bit, yeah? And then we get a new water level, which I extrapolated. And then you can see a difference between what I had before, the status quo, the base run, and how much your flood hazard, your depths and extent reduce due to that mitigation strategy. Yeah, that's just the one strategy. I'm just going to do the one. There's other strategies as well. And this has worked well to a nice collaboration with the folks from the regional municipality of Wood Buffalo, and we were able to produce a conference proceedings paper for that. Yeah, I was actually talking to Jay just at lunchtime how some of this end user engagement we can maybe tease out more, you know, the storytelling from from our research. Yeah, I'm not sure if this might be a way of doing that, or we can refine that. I'm not sure. We'll have to ask maybe some folks from the KM team afterwards. So we got a few more minutes. 1, 2. Okay, I'll just. I'm just going to touch on this ice jam flood forecasting, and this is the Churchill River in Labrador. Again, we use our base run here, but for forecasting, you kind of, with a hydrological model, you can determine in the next 3 days, let's say, if you want to do a forecast in the next 3 days, what my flows are going to be, my min or max. So you can constrain this. Here I've constrained, I'm going to only take random values from that. You can see my ensemble runs too, that's shrunk a bit, or it's narrower, right? This was before and now after. And that is also very effective. I got different percentiles here. Determine what your probability is that certain flood threshold levels would be exceeded. And this was work with the government of Newfoundland and Labrador, and Ali Khan, he's now, used to be there too, but he's now with National Research Council of Canada, which is actually quite nice because that opens up a few more possibilities there, you know. Okay, and with that, I'll leave it at that. And if you have a question, I'm glad to answer that. Yeah.
We have time for one 30-second question, if anyone has one. Saman. Go ahead.
So I was wondering if you have, how do you determine the location of the ice jam? For example, this year, this particular location may be jammed, maybe. Is there any certainty that the same location is going to get an ice jam during the next years?
You basically, you can narrow it down to reaches. Yeah, there are different spots along the river where you can have a lodgement, or where that tow occurs, very often in constrictions or islands or sandbars. It has to hook on something, right? So, and if you look at past data, some reaches have a higher propensity to lodgement than others. Yeah, that's about the best we can do so far. Yeah. Okay, good. Thanks.
Our next speaker is Saman Razabi. I had the pleasure of a 12-hour drive with Saman just over the weekend, and I learned a lot about him and his research on uncertainty, and also that he's a champion of inclusive research. So please welcome Saman.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you, Graham, for that kind introduction. Yeah, we're just back from a 2-day trip to Cumberland House, where I learned a lot from Graham and others and Indigenous people there. It's great to be here. Thanks, Jay, for putting this together. Nice to be in this room in person after a couple of years. And thanks to Mark for helping facilitate this and many others. So, of course, I'm here to give you an update about what I've been doing the past couple of years. And I think we've achieved a lot. Most notable one, I think, is I decided to grow a beard. As you can see, I know it looks ugly. Just be supportive. My wife hates it too. But anyways, this is going to be my look for the first time, and I'm hoping to keep it for some time just to try to look a bit more sophisticated, hopefully at some point. So these are people who've been working with me. I'm not going to read all the names, but yeah, so some of them have already graduated in the past year or so. But I'm going to give an overview of what they've been doing. So this slide shows my overall hope or vision that I had a few years ago when we started running IMPC, or Integrated Modeling Program for Canada. And the idea was all about integration of different disciplines and modeling platforms. And in the past more recently, Carl Schmidt and I have been co-leading this with a lot of input from a lot of you guys here. And the idea have been to just to bring the different worlds together. I'm coming more from hydrology, water resources management background, but we've been trying to bring in other pieces, and I'm going to touch on some of these in this talk. And I forgot to bring in the IMPC logo. Thank you very much, Graham, for showing that. I should have done it myself. So for hydrologic modeling piece, I decided to show what Mohammed Abdulhamid has been doing with me in the past couple of years on permafrost thaw modeling. And that is some area that I'm also very new to, but it is quite interesting because, first of all, there is a really limited data up there. There is a lot of challenges and a lot of implications of permafrost thaw that we don't understand well. And models can be good explorative tools for us when we have no or limited data on what might happen. And basically, we've been trying to understand how energy balance and water balance have been coupled under or basically such that different types of behaviors, dynamic behaviors might emerge over time under global warming. And he's already shown that some very interesting results. And implications is, of course, the active layer is deepening, meaning more methane release, for example, that would provide positive feedback to warming. There's going to be a lot of land subsidence and soil compaction because we are having more or deeper active layer. And of course, we are seeing a lot of changes in lateral connectivity of soil, which means a lot of implications for hydrology. Anyways, so papers are out there some. So the other piece, so we're done with our system-wide water management modeling platform. This was a huge undertaking done by Mustaqim, Alisha, Kasra, Keshavars, Leila Iman, and we've simulated, we have a model, operational model that works with 50 plus reservoirs, a lot of irrigation nodes and so on. And it can simulate trade-offs, estimate trade-offs between different objectives, hydropower, irrigation expansion under different climate change scenarios and so on. And what I'm perhaps most excited about that is to couple that to economic modeling. And some years ago, I felt a bit ambitious. I reached out to Laurie Bradford, who is an economist at Waterloo, and we decided to co-supervise a PhD student together, Leila Iman. And the idea was to bring that water resources engineering model to real economy, not the engineering economy type of school that I'm coming from. And at first, it looked quite challenging, and I thought, oh, that was a big mistake. The thesis is not going to go anywhere. But now, 4 or 5 years down the road, I think we've achieved some, I've learned a lot through this process. Most notably, let me tell you why that is important, this type of interdisciplinary research. So engineers look at only a small portion of economy. So of course, we have many different economic sectors that contribute to GDP at different levels. And engineers in water only look at direct water using sectors connected to the water system, like irrigation, hydropower, domestic water use, or basically whoever sector that is using directly water. What we do, I'm an engineer, we typically ignore intersectoral and interregional socioeconomic interactions. And that is what economists do. And basically bringing that knowledge, for example, through input-output models, we've been able to look at intersectoral, interregional interactions connected to water and basically sectors that do not directly use water. And then you can see how benefit, for example, or how they suffer from our water policy or changes in water policy or climate change and water shortage. And just to show you some results with that model, integrated modeling platform, then you could, for example, see the impact of the recent $4 billion investment in irrigation in the province. And you could see, for example, what would be, for example, economic benefits to different sectors, to different parts of the basin. And the numbers I'm showing are in the 2015 in million Canadian dollars based on 2015 prices. And for example, this 2 for $242 million would be, for example, the benefit of this construction or $4 billion investment in a year, for example. And you can see, for example, what goes to what sector. Even some of the sectors are not water using. For example, $1 million to information and cultural industries that we often ignore in water engineering. And $1 million to transportation and warehousing. More important than that, you can see, for example, $77 million would be the benefit to that area in Alberta. So, and that's basically where water moves upstream or basically goes uphill. And you can see, for example, that Alberta would benefit through these intersectoral, interregional, socioeconomic interactions. And that tells us that we need to have an integrated approach to governance. And for example, our issues in Saskatchewan with water is not only our issues, it's, for example, a basin-wide or prairie-wide issue. We have been looking at some socio-hydrologic modeling as well in the farming communities, irrigation districts in particular, and basically working on the demand management side. Of course, not everything is about supply. And we know that farmers change behaviors in response to policy changes, government incentives, and so on. And we've done that through agent-based modeling. And what I'm showing here, for example, is the so-called Rebound Phenomenon or J1 products. And basically, that is what we do. If we typically in water engineering sector, we do something, for example, we improve the efficiency of irrigation with the hope to basically reduce the demand. So water use goes down initially, but after some years, you see that rebounds for some obvious reasons, sometimes not as obvious. But it's very important to understand these dynamics when you want to make policy. And basically this way, through these modeling that are primarily explorative, not predictive, they can help you explore your ideas and see what possible trajectory systems might take in the future. I'm shifting gear here a little bit towards more our theoretical stuff. Some of you already know that I've been working on sensitivity analysis, which is a branch of applied mathematics. And so we've been quite active in that area in the past 2 years. That image was taken just a few months before the pandemic hit. And back then we ran this very large workshop pondering about the future of sensitivity analysis. And back then I was working on the area for, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years. And so long story short, sensitivity analysis is now kind of an official discipline or meta discipline because it brings different disciplines together. And so we have made a community of practitioners and researchers in that field. And this paper basically tries to depict what that group thinks about the future of sensitivity analysis in the next 10 years or so. And related to that, we've done a lot on our made in GIWS sensitivity analysis toolbox. So this is something that we've been working on for 8, 9 years already, but the past 2 years have been very productive because we have basically recast everything and our coding, thanks to Jay for support to hire a good computer science student, Cordell Batchard, and also Kasra Keshavaras, who've been working on this for over a year already. And now this is the VARS tool website that is available. And now we have a new tab, download Python package. And we've been basically developing everything in Python with a lot of new functionalities. And this is, for example, the GitHub page. Now we have a bunch of tutorials, very well commented, to be used in workshops, classrooms, and basically walk the students through the process of sensitive analysis and how to run that for different applications. And this is not only water related, this could be used in a range of fields. again, I'm shifting gears. I have revitalized interest in artificial intelligence and machine learning. In my former life, before beginning my PhD, I spent some time on that in research and industry, and then I had abandoned it. And again, past 2 years, I got back to it. And you know what, that was thanks to having sabbaticals. Basically, you have free time to read and talk to people. And you know what, basically my sabbatical was supposed to be half in the UK, the other half in Australia. Of course, never happened because of the pandemic. But we managed to do something, run workshops mostly online, and we've made some progress. And now I have Kaylan here, my new man, co-supervised by Jay, and he's helping us to kind of push this agenda forward. The idea is, or the argument that we're having is that I'm not myself very satisfied with the status quo around AI and machine learning, in particular in earth science and hydrology. And the reason is, I think there is a bit of hype, and we are in an isolation phase, meaning most AI machine learning applications have divorced from process understanding and knowledge base. And of course, in the past 10 years, 15 years, there has been efforts on hybridization of the two, but that hybridization still has roots in isolation. And basically, we're pondering about some co-evolution phase where we can use machine learning to extract new knowledge directly from data. And that is what our man, Kaylan Lee, has started doing. And so, okay, I'm not sure how I'm doing. 1 minute? Okay, so yeah, international collaborations. I've been working with some UK folks and Australian folks, of course, as a result of my sabbatical. I thought that to showcase this, that we basically joined a team under the IASH, International Association of Hydrological Sciences, and we contributed case studies, paired events from Canada for Assiniboine floods and Ottawa floods. And our objective was to see how our governance, flood risk management has improved in response to seeing those flood risks. And anyways, after a couple of years, now the work is done. Actually, this piece has been accepted in Nature, so it's gonna come out soon. And you know, so this international initiative got us a lot of new insights, perhaps, on how we have achieved and where we have failed in basically managing flood risk in Canada and globally, and what we can learn from each other from for different places in the world. And this is, I think, my very last slide. So some EDI activities. So I've been, of course, EDI has been quite important always in the past 2 years or 3 years. Most of us have been thinking about that. I have also reflected on some of the issues more from where I'm coming from, a non-native English speaker, first generation immigrant to Canada. And that is basically these two pieces reflect on my personal experience and what I have learned about EDI from my perspective. So I'm just putting them up there in case there was any interest. And of course, I'd love to discuss and talk about these things if anyone was interested. So that's that. And just going back to the YouTube discussion, I created that YouTube channel a couple of years ago. I have 250 subscribers. Congratulations. You know what, this is, yeah, science, very difficult to convince people to subscribe to your channel. And you know, anyway, so I've been learning how to edit videos, and I have 2 videos in production for months already. Hopefully sometime I can finish them, but if there was some technical support, that would be ideal. Yeah, thank you very much.
So Saman used up his 15 minutes, so you have to get him at the break. Next, we get to welcome Grant Ferguson, who's the deepest geologist I've ever met.
Okay, thank you, Graham. And now for something a little different. So I'm going to go over some of the things I've been up to over the past few years. I guess as a jumping off point, we had some discussion about working with artists and other writers and whatnot. So I'm still immensely proud of this, although this was just me and Jen McIntosh talking, and then Louise Arnell turned it into this piece of art and several others that were in a book that she put out as part of the virtual water gallery. But I think it really speaks to some of the ideas that we were talking about. And, just recently was pushed to write a blog post on this Water Underground by Tom Gleason. And, Tom's idea was, groundwater is not very photogenic. And that's probably true aside from a handful of springs or something like that. So really great to work with an artist like Louise who can, paint a picture like this. So really what we've been thinking about over the past few years, and I'm going to try and touch on these over a few different slides and studies that we've done, naming collaborators and giving credit due where it belongs. So some questions that we've been asking is like, well, how much groundwater is there, right? And how deep does it circulate? What's it connected to, right? So we've had a lot of these questions out there, and some of them are maybe they're not so important because you can't use all of groundwater, obviously, but it's a basic question that we really don't have a handle on. And a lot of people have made attempts at it. So we made our attempt too, but really the connections and how groundwater circulates has been really of interest to me and a lot of other people I've been working with. And where this comes from is, there's been this big push over the past, I'm going to say 20 years, maybe longer. That's really probably as long as I've been involved in the science, going back to my grad school days. But this real push towards groundwater, surface water interaction and recognizing that it's all one resource. And then you look at how that's actually being treated in the models. It's like, is it? Like, how strongly is that connected? And you look at a lot of these integrated models and, it's a black box underneath, or they're really only talking about a few meters deep below the water table. And then you look at the average depth of a water well, say globally or in Canada, they're about the same. And they're like 30 to 50 meters below ground surface. So is that really captured in these models? And what do we actually know about these things? So as usual, and I guess we'll have to see what he follows up with next. I mean, we were prodded and pushed in this direction by Jeff McDonald. So this was actually something that, we'd started playing around with this, and the story goes, and this is, how great things happen over coffee and whatever else, that this was actually something, Jen McIntosh and I, before her GIWS distinguished lecture back in 2018, I believe, just sitting there, prepping for her lecture and, drinking coffee and having a snack. And Jeff says, that's a really good idea you're working on. You should write it up like this. It's like, oh, okay. So, a few collaborators later, and it turned into this, but really thinking about how do we envision, like, where's the bottom of the hydrologic cycle? How deep do we go? And depends on who you talk to, you're going to get different answers. So like a lot of the critical zone community and watershed kind of catchment hydrologists, they're thinking about some sort of permeability contrast and maybe in a little bit different way than some hydrogeologists might. And then there's ideas around active circulation, whatever that might mean. Words are tossed around without really thinking about clear definitions. And then finally, things that Jennifer and I have been thinking about for years is, well, once you get down there, there's a water quality shift. And then, do we actually see that water come back to the surface? Would you want to use that water? But is that a real boundary when you start to pump these systems? And sometimes it isn't. So along with that, we started asking, well, how much groundwater is there, right? And part of this was, spurred by, friendly debate and, pushing each other back and forth with Tom Gleason, who I've worked with back and forth over the years. And Tom and others came up with this estimate. There's 22.6 million cubic kilometers of groundwater down to an arbitrary depth of 2 kilometers. So we started looking at it, it's like, well, some of that's saline and you can't really use it all. And then there's other people out there like, the Barb Sherwood Lawlers and others that are interested in what's going on like a few kilometers deep, because that might be where, a good chunk of the world's biomass is, and we're going to store nuclear waste and all these other things down there. But that had never really been tackled either. There was a kind of back of the envelope type calculation that Barbara and her postdoc at the time, Oliver Ward, had done. They came up with 8.5 cubic kilometers. So we redid those estimates with a large group involving Jay and Jeff and others. And we came up with, this plot here, magically there's like 43 cubic kilometers or 43 million cubic kilometers of groundwater. And then it becomes, well, that's a big number, and it really increases the pool. But again, probably can't use most of this, right? No one's drilling wells to however many kilometers deep, most of it's saline. So then we kind of spin back and say, okay, so what does this mean? And what does this tell us about the hydrologic cycle, right? I mean, if there's this big, huge store down there, maybe it's too saline to use, maybe it's been down there for too long. Is it actively circulating? What does that even mean? And so we've been playing around with that question on the side here too. So one of our tools that we used to look at this was to look at the water isotopes. So if you look at the hydrogen and oxygen and their stable isotopes on the water molecule, they basically fall along this, well, we don't have much of a pointer here, but the inset there shows that we've got a lot of them fall along what we call the global meteoric water line. So this is a pattern that's observed in precipitation, most shallow groundwaters, soil waters, surface waters around the world. Once we get into deeper waters, it tends to shift. It looks like, old evaporated seawater, or there's been other things that have been observed, say in the Canadian Shield and other similar environments where it's a shift off that line in the other direction. But what we found is that these things tend to fall on the meteoric water line, which would be kind of compressed in this deuterium excess or oxygen 18 depletion space, that vertical line. And it happens down to about 4 kilometers in its deepest spot. So it's spotty. There's not a whole lot of data once you start to look this deep. But we do see that, there's water that's falling out of the sky that circulates to, in most parts of North America, at least 1 kilometer deep. In some places, say against the Rocky Mountains, it might be several kilometers deep. So what does this tell us about, the meteoric, the water cycle? It's, well, we've got active circulation down to probably much further than we're normally thinking about. And so we've been playing around with this a little bit more. So again, work that's involved a few people here. We've kind of pitched these ideas around with Jay, and I probably need to update him on where we've made it with this. And Jeff got really excited about parts of this. And it's mostly been Jen and I picking at this with some help from Scott Dusheko recently. And what we actually pulled off here, and what we think we've pulled off, and we don't quite know how to interpret it, is if we look at like a base flow separation, like a hydrograph separation for the planet, right? So we do these sorts of things, and people like Jeff have been thinking about this for years. Where does water come from? And you can look at, well, the water that comes out of the soil and out of groundwater looks like this, and there's this component that looks like direct runoff, and you can do a mass balance and figure out how much is from this and how much is from that. Well, if you start playing around with this and looking at the chloride budget for the planet and how much discharges out of streams going to the ocean, you can explain most of that with shallow groundwater and surface water runoff. And you really don't have to you really can't invoke too much from deeper chloride. So once we get down to a few hundred meters, we're seeing chloride concentrations that are more like seawater. If you go much deeper than that, it's a couple times seawater, right? So you really can't invoke much of that. And that tends to match up with, we see a decrease in the percent modern carbon. So that would be water that's, hundreds to thousands of years old at depths of a few hundred meters, and then substantially older than that as we go deeper. So on the right there, we've got a compilation of groundwater ages from noble gas analyses from around the world. And you can see once you get down below, maybe a kilometer or so, ages are hundreds of thousands to millions of years old. So there's not much interaction with the rest of the hydrologic cycle. So we actually did this sort of thing and kind of playing back and forth. And we actually tried to do a hydrograph separation. And then Jeff and Scott looked at me and said, well, that's kind of nonsensical, because you're not going to be able to pull off like how much road salt is up there, and what's direct deposition from the atmosphere and all that. So we kind of flipped it around and said, well, how much groundwater could we see and still have some component in there? So messing around with this, we've got our median concentration for groundwater below 500 meters deep is 30 grams per liter. So for context there, the total salinity of seawater is 35 grams per liter, right? So in excess of seawater is our typical concentration. And here we've gotten this, what's a histogram? It's a pretty simple histogram. There's only been a handful of attempts at this to look at, well, how much I guess, groundwater do we have going into the ground, which for our purposes here, we'll assume is also coming out. And most of those estimates are between like 10 and 20,000 cubic kilometers a year, right? So the answer is it's probably less than 1% of groundwater, or less than 1% of stream flow can come from groundwater that's more than a few hundred meters deep. So depending on who you're asking, I mean, maybe some of those models, they do have it right, that we should be focused on the upper, few meters, tens of meters, maybe 100 meters in an extreme case. But the kicker is that some of these people are actually using these things. The other thing that we've been playing around with is, well, how permeable is this? And people have made these attempts in the past, notably Craig Manning and Steve Ingebrigtsen about 20 years ago, and a more recent attempt and by Akziger Zupancic et al. From a couple of years ago. We redid this all looking at some of the noble gas concentrations that have been collected from around the world. So these things can date waters back to millions of years old. And we think that a lot of this, I guess, lack of interaction with these deeper rocks is that they're less permeable than what we've previously thought. So maybe good news for things like storing nuclear waste and whatnot, although we probably have to go much deeper than what we've previously been planning. So those, I guess, test sites in Ontario, they're only down several hundred meters. And, this would suggest, go a kilometer and maybe it's safer. So the shifting gears here to think about, well, what does this all mean for deep groundwater? Because a lot of our, I guess, management ideas or ideas around renewability, sustainability have been built around ideas like recharge rate. In other words, the amount that goes into the ground, that gives us a measure of how much we can take out of the ground. Or other people like Mark Bierkens and Yoshi Wada, and they're not the first ones. This was just in a review paper they wrote. Said, well, it's turnover time, and that should tell us something about what's going on. And this is something that, again, Tom and I have been thinking back and forth with over the years, and ideas about, well, where does this actually come from, right? Because there's some amount that comes from recharge in that water that would have been flowing out to streams, and then there's some amount that's just straight depletion. And it turns out you probably have to look at both of these to figure things out. And then the answer becomes not so simple. It's not the simple metric that you have to say, well, we want to maintain the water levels, we want to maintain discharge to streams, and you have to balance both those things out. So good news for hydrologists, we've got work to do and there's no simple solutions to any of this stuff. More recently, we've been playing with ideas around, well, what is renewable groundwater? So these are some interesting conversations we've had with Mark Cuthbert and Mark Bierkens and Richard Taylor. And I thought these were kind of interesting ideas, right? So previously it was something based on fluxes or storage, and then capture also comes into play here. And I like this, which I think is from Mark Cuthbert, is the problem with all these things, especially capture, is it blames the resource instead of the user, which again is one of those things about what are we actually trying to do. So again, it gets back to, it's like this idea of renewable groundwater is more of an emergent behavior rather than something you can quantify ahead of time. And then finally, I mean, I think this was what spurred Mark Bierkens to, start talking to us, because I think he was a little irritated with how we cited one of his papers in this. And so this was a slightly earlier one that, the usual suspects that I commonly work with were involved with, right? This idea that, well, all this groundwater is old, you can't use it, it'll take that long to be replaced. But behavior of a groundwater system before you pump versus after you pump are different. And I guess one of the big takeaways here is, like, it's not the old water that's necessarily the problem. If you look to some of these areas, it's very young water and you still get a huge amount of groundwater depletion. So finally, just touching on a few kind of recent projects, and to make it look like I'm not just playing with global data sets and don't get out to the field or collect my own data while students collect my own data. So this is one that just came out last week. Work that I'm pretty proud of, working with Jen McIntosh and our recently graduated PhD student, Jihoon Kim, who's off to a postdoc at University of Calgary pretty soon. This was work done in the Colorado Plateau, thinking about, well, how do we reconnect these waters to the rest of the hydrologic cycle? And the answer for the Colorado Plateau was, you have to erode a canyon the size of the Grand Canyon into it, and then you manufacture new discharge areas. And so we managed to figure all this out by thinking about what the geology looked like going back over the past few million years of what Utah, Colorado, Northern Arizona looked like, and then by grabbing some krypton samples, and krypton 81 has a half-life of just over 200,000 years, so you can date groundwaters back to around 1 million or so years old. And something a little bit more locally. So this was actually just yesterday here in Saskatchewan. Another couple of students who we're working with. So this is Chandler Noise, but Nick Dutka was also out there. So we've been trying to figure out, well, what does this look like in Saskatchewan, right? And our big event in terms of putting water into the ground, into the deeper subsurface in Saskatchewan was the last glaciation, or maybe the last several glaciations. So again, we're going to throw, some different isotope tracers at this and see what we find, right? And I think what it might show is that we've got groundwaters that are very weakly connected to the rest of the hydrologic cycle. And if we use these things, they're not maybe going to come back all that quickly. So that's it. I see Graham kind of lurking towards me, so I should stop.
Thanks, Grant. Grab Grant at the break if you've got questions. Next up, we're going to have a video from Jeff McDonald. Jeff's in the field right now, so he's recorded his presentation, and he's going to be doing it with a little bit of music. So please enjoy.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jeff McDonald, and I appreciate this chance to give a recorded lecture. I'm in the field today in Ontario with my postdoc, Magali Nahemi. But what I wanted to do is to give you an update from our Hillslope Hydrology Lab in terms of what's been going on, what's currently going on, and where we're headed in the next 12 months or so. Many of you I've probably not met, given that we've had many hires in the last couple of years. My group of about a dozen or so studies rainfall runoff and snowmelt runoff processes. Our work is field-based and mostly at the hill slope and catchment scale. And really we go after three questions. Where does water go when it rains? What flow path does it take to the stream? And how long does it take to get there? And as you'll see a little later, we're asking those same questions now of trees and vegetation in terms of the other flux out of the catchment. That is evapotranspiration. Since we last met, it's really some time has passed. I went on sabbatical at the end of 2018. So it's been many years now since I've been on campus. Of course, that sabbatical was at the Luxembourg Institute for Science and Technology. I worked with a fellow, Laurent Pfister, and had a wonderful year, capped off with probably the best experience of my academic life, and that was a 60th birthday party symposium where about 40 of my former postdocs and PhD students came along for the event, along with a few from University of Saskatchewan and a couple of close colleagues. That ended, and in 2020, I started a stint in Argentina at the National University in San Luis, but of course, COVID hit and a hasty retreat home was made. Like many, I've been working from home and over the period of the main kind of COVID shutdown, doing a lot of catchment data wrap up. Like many of you, there's been many special issues in hydrology journals devoted to this kind of synthesis. And for me, towards the end of my career, it's been very helpful to wrap up different projects. This is a screenshot from our Panola group. This is a watershed where I've been working since the early 1990s. You're seeing many old and wizened faces here, in addition to mine, old colleagues like Rick Hooper, Jake Peters, and others. So it was quite enjoyable as well. We did that for Mai, the Swift Current watershed, and a couple of others. The other thing I've been working on personally is a textbook called Perceptual Models in Catchment Hydrology. And my hope is to have that completed by the end of the year, and then to use that as a course text for a new course I'm teaching in the MWS program in fall of this year. But my group is really made up of my postdocs, PhD students, master's students, and we've really fanned out. Most of our work is international. This is some work of a PhD student I co-advise, Adriana Vega, who yesterday defended her PhD. She's based at the University of Queensland in Brisbane. And the field site you're seeing here is quite a lovely spot in Northeast Queensland, where we have in a 200 by 200 meter plot, 300 different tree species. And we're going after these questions on the age, origin, and pathway of that water that gets transpired with stable isotopes. She's doing some other work on a bauxite mine in Cape York. Hongshu Wang, a postdoc here, is leading a project in China that I lead, focused on water sustainability linked to apple production. And we have some parallel work going on in the Luz Plateau. Mitra, a PhD student at EPFL in Lausanne, Switzerland, is following up from Magali Nahemi, who did work there on an isotope lysimeter study. Zitong Zhu is a postdoc from Tsinghua University, and I have a few students that I'm helping to co-advise there. Jitu is actually a postdoc, and the work focuses on a catchment just outside of Beijing. Pedro Fernandez, a postdoc, is stationed through COVID down in one of the windiest cities on Earth, Punta Arenas, Chile. We're trying to take advantage of that windiness and looking at wind impacts on rainfall isotope composition. Vicky Lee is a new master's student working in Trinidad on coffee plantations, trying to get at tracing water source analysis. And another new student, Fatima Khan, is at University of Birmingham. I'm co-advising Fatima, and we're trying to take advantage of a free air carbon CO2 enrichment study, a so-called FACE site, at a site just north of Birmingham. In terms of new plans, my work is shifting a little bit to go after a new question related to fire impacts on runoff pathways. So my work has been largely runoff generation focused these last few decades. And of course, because of the BC fires and then flooding last fall, which will likely be Canada's most expensive insurable disaster, I'm trying to orient some of my research to tackle these questions. Where does water go when it rains on this burned land where there's water repellency and hydrophobicity? I'm just wrapping up a Catalyst grant to spend some time in my next sabbatical in 2023 at the University of Valencia. This is a group that specializes in fire runoff. And of course, my discovery grant that's up for renewal will shift in this direction as well. The last thing I should probably mention, and this will be kind of some of the focus, just diagrammatically you're seeing here on this last animation. The last thing I want to mention is just what's going on at the MOST facility. Of course, MOST is a facility of the Global Institute, just across the street from where we are in Environment Canada. And this is supported by Kim Jansen, my lab manager for the Isotope Lab in the Environment Canada building, and then Cody Miller, who's the MOST lab manager. We have a new partnership with Ian Fleming over in civil engineering, a new project that started last week, funded by NSERC, working with an American company producing a mulch used for mine covers. We're looking at new work with Nutrien, studying infiltration into potash piles, and some new work on outdoor paired mesocosms and dragging Bing C into this work from the Department of Soil Science. So I thought I'd try to wrap up, and rather than a normal wrap up, I thought I'd try to do this musically to stay with the title of my talk, and this will be my my musical summary.
Unfortunately, we can't get Jeff for questions, but he'll be back at some point, so you'll be able to ask him questions then. Our next speaker is going to be coming in via Zoom, and it's Dr. Laurie Bradford.
Hi, everyone. Can someone just let me know if you can see the slides on the screen? Looks like it. Okay, I'm coming here from Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis. In order to deepen my land acknowledgement, I wanted to teach you 3 words today. It's all the same word, it's water, but on behalf of the partners that I work with in Treaty Territories 2 through 8 and the unceded territory of the Carcross-Tagish First Nation in the Yukon, I wanted to teach you to say these words in Cree, in Dene, and in Saulteaux or Ojibwe. So it's something that you can take home that you've learned. So in Cree, the word water is pronounced nipi, N-I-P-I. So give that a try. 1, 2, 3, nipi. In Saulteaux or Ojibwe, the word water is pronounced ni-bi. So instead of a P, it's a B sound this time. Let's give it a try on 3. 1, 2, 3, ni-bi. And in Dene Zulene, the word water is pronounced tu, or you would say tu neda if you were talking about drinking water. So let's try the word tu, T-U, on 3. 1, 2, 3, tu. Thank you so much. Now you've learned how to say it in 3 languages. I want to be really quick with my bio. Most of you know that the things that I do are to create collisions between natural and social sciences in order to have greater social impact. So I have a background in biochemistry and a minor in English, a master in environmental science, as well as my PhD is in social psychology. I have been through 3 different postdoc positions and 3 years as a research associate before I came to my first academic appointment in SENS in 2018. Since then, I've moved to my new role as a Canada Research Chair, SSHRC Tier 2, in incorporating social and cultural sciences into engineering design, and that's jointly appointed between the School of Professional Development and the College of Engineering and in SENS. In a lot of my background work, I've combined social sciences and water security, permafrost thaw, wildfire, urban migration, environmental crisis, mental health, and planetary health kind of research. And so that has given me the background skills in order to understand where some of our gaps in pedagogy are so that the graduates we produce have greater social and cultural impact on their work. So right now I'm a member of the GIWS. I'm also a member of a project over in our psychology department called the Academic Mental Illness Project. So with that, we're doing a national survey, interview, focus groups on the mental health effects of academia. Also a member of the College of Engineering's Sigma program, helping to produce entrepreneurs from our engineering undergraduate students. So some of my current grants include a CRC, a CFI GELF, which is building both a modular on-campus experimental design lab, as well as a mobile lab, like a mobile makerspace that we can take out to communities and do an engineering design work out there. I recently got a SSHRC Ideas Lab looking at circular economy in terms of food waste. I also got an aid to scholarly journals to keep the Engaged Scholar Journal running. So I'm the chief editor of that journal. So I have a bunch of other grants on the go right now. It's very busy, but that's just to say that most of them are working on how we do that combination between social and natural and technical sciences. So a show of hands, how many people in the room believe that your work has social impact? And I can't see all of you, but I imagine most of you are putting up your hands. And if you could just turn to your neighbor and tell them, what impact do you think it has? Like, I can imagine Mustafa's work on hail will have great impacts in terms of the insurance industry and all the claims for damage to our cars, but also impacts on, our mental health, because some of us have great attachment to our vehicles, and some of us really need them to complete our day-to-day activities. And I imagine Carl's work has great social impact in terms of reducing the risk in communities where ice jams happen, where flooding happens. So most of us could probably say that we have social impact from our work. But did you know that in 2019, Canada really formalized our ability to have to respond to those social impacts? So we used to have an Impact Assessment Act that was very much focused on environmental and economic impacts of all of our large builds on federal lands. And then provincially, any kind of large builds on provincial land as well. But in 2019, the Act changed to recognize that we now have to assess not just the environmental and the economic effects, but the social, the health, and the cultural impacts of our major projects. And along with that, we also have to assess the effects of projects on Indigenous peoples and their rights. So we have to start to develop robust approaches to include the additional steps that we need to assess those social, health, cultural, and impacts on Indigenous people for all the things that we do. So that means we now have to have a practice where we include social and cultural sciences in what we do. So if we want our work to continue to have that social impact and to continue to be sought out across the province, the country, and the world, we need to make sure that we include the social and cultural sciences in everything we do. Our citation rates will also go up and will maintain that social impact. So over the last 5 years or so, researchers have been looking at how much work we do in terms of social sustainability compared to the rest. And you know, some are saying we're not in a sustainability age anymore. We're now in a post-sustainability age where our assessment of impact on society and culture has not kept up with our technological advances. So what we do see in the research, and this is from a review by you in 2015, is that a lot of our resources and our research efforts have been focused on the environmental and the economic, with not as much in the social realm. So one more question out to the audience. Can you right now think of a social or cultural science? You may have taken something in undergrad or master's. You know, is it maybe, you know, economics, or maybe you took an environmental studies course. Maybe you took a language. So when I looked across the University of Saskatchewan, these 32 are the social and cultural sciences that are currently on offer, just on our campus. Now there are more. There are hundreds of different social science, humanities, and arts disciplines and departments across the globe. But can you honestly say to yourself that you have explored how your work might connect with one of these other disciplines and how their work might inform what you do? So I chaired a defense just last week. Dan Beveridge in SENS graduated with his PhD in sustainability, in environment and sustainability. And a major chapter of his work, with publications coming out of it, is how he took a linguistics approach to the definition of sustainability. So realizing after a systemic review of definitions of sustainability, how the way that we build our words and define our terms can really impede progress. He found that there's been more debate about how we define sustainability than actually about implementing indicators to monitor that sustainability over time. So these other disciplines are really important. So all of this is to say that I need you. Part of my CRC program is to examine what we call mutualisms. So that is how we can bring together social and cultural sciences and Indigenous knowledge and knowledge systems into our design work. Now, all of you do design work, the way you design your research programs, the way you come up with new theories and test them, the way that you design experiments that you undertake in the field or in the lab, bench work, like we heard from Lee Wilson. All of that involves mutualisms. And typically we work with people who are most close to us. We call these proximal interdisciplinary work. So like a biochemist working with a biologist, or a civil and an environmental engineer working together. We need to start looking more at those distal interdisciplinary connections to gather more mutualism so we can better understand the social and cultural impacts of their work. And so here I share just a few examples from Indigenous scholars that have been shared with me. So there's a book called Why Ravens and Wolves Hunt Together, and it was written by author Celestine Alec and Carver Joel Good from BC's West Coast. And the story tells of the complementarity between ravens and their ability to get a really high look at the environment around them and gather around weakened prey. And that attracts wolves. And so wolves and ravens hunt together and use their complementary skills to survive. A couple of words that I learned over the years. Awechewin is a Anishinaabe word that means to set things up for a desired outcome. So such as manipulating a small area of forest to direct a rabbit toward a snare. So what that means is to catch prey, you have to know about both the tools that you need, so how to make a prey, but also prey behavior. So you need to be able to have observed and really learned about what drives or motivates a prey to move in a certain way. And finally, the Tlicho term eletziza means to share work together, to weave together, as in tying different animal hides to strengthen shelters against outside weather. So this comes from the Tlicho tribe, which uses different kinds of animal hides to better waterproof their houses, their teepees. So now, while we're moving from a sustainability to a post-sustainability age, and from a triple bottom line to a quadruple top line approach, we need to consider how we weave together social, cultural, and the more technical sciences. So I need you, in the next 2 years of my CRC program, I'm going to be undertaking a variety of different research projects, locally with individuals in case study kind of work, and more globally in terms of social network analysis of how engineers and other technical sciences bring social and cultural sciences into their work. So there's a list of some of the things we're doing. A really interesting one is with Regan Mandrick in computer science, and how Minecraft and Kerbal and SimCity integrate social and cultural challenges into their work. So if you have interest in being involved in any of that kind of work, or if your students would like to volunteer themselves as case study students, and I can observe how they integrate social and cultural sciences into their work, I'm interested in hearing from you. So thank you, everybody. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Laurie. If you're still there, there is time for questions, maybe.
And looking at wind impacts on rainfall isotope.
So Jeff's still talking away on the computer down here. But if anyone has a question for Laurie, you could approach the mic, and then we'll be over to Sherry for our last talk today.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Shelley Luce. I'm working with GIWS on a number of things. I think we were on the same call yesterday, Laurie. I was just wondering if this would be an example of integrating the two types of sciences. I've worked on a master plan for the LA River in Los Angeles. And one of the things that the engineering team has tried to do is incorporate the impacts of restoration on gentrification of neighborhoods, because the LA River unfortunately has a lot of really low-income neglected neighborhoods along the river, and there's fear of restoration because that can cause property prices to go up and drive out existing residents. So it's been hard to integrate that, but it's been fascinating to watch how they've tried. Is that the kind of work you're thinking about?
Absolutely. Yeah, it made me think about a term called Amenity Migration, which I think was created by Norm McIntyre in the tourism management discipline, where, you know, if you have certain kinds of amenities, waterfront, for example, that's been managed and cleaned up, it attracts different kind of demographics. So human geographers are really interested in that kind of work. And if there's a way to get human geographers to talk with city planners and to, you know, talk with engineers about the design of the buildings that go along the river corridors, then we may be able to have a more equitable and just distribution of the groups of people from equity deserving groups that live in those areas. Typically, we see people from equity deserving groups in the least valuable, most toxic parts of our cities. So it would be great if they could work together. Yeah. Thank you, Shelley.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Laurie. And thanks, Shelley, for your question. We're going to shift now to our last speaker for this afternoon, who is Sherry Westbrook.
There we go. Well, I'm not tall. Can you hear me? Hi, everyone. So nice to see you. And hello to everybody online that we just got a glimpse of for a second there. Really happy that you're here. I think this morning we saw some pretty great talks. I'm sorry I had to step out for a student committee meeting briefly, but I heard they were very polished. And then we just listened to a bunch of faculty talk about, what they've been doing for a decade, and those were very polished talks too. And I'm here to lower your expectations. I do not have a polished talk. This, and I'm not going to talk about the last decade. I'm going to talk about the last 4 days. This is data that a number of students have been out in the field collecting over the last 30 hours. And there's data up until this morning, kind of around lunchtime. So I would like to thank some of my students on my team that have been working tirelessly, especially before the event and getting equipment out. We have some data to share today. We have lots more things coming, but the students couldn't, stay up all night to collect data all night in the dark when there's high grizzly bear risk. And then I also want to thank John Pomeroy's team. I have some of his results too to share today. Mostly pictures. We're going to do a picture show. Okay, so if you have been listening to any type of media, I have been exploiting Twitter in the last few days. So it's not just about scientists putting information out there for public consumption. I'm going to show the kind of other way around, where I've been able to scour things on Twitter and put it back into complement some of the knowledge that we are gaining from studying out there and how fast you can learn about an event. So in Alberta, there has been a massive rainstorm. A bunch of clouds basically sat over Kananaskis country and a large portion of Alberta and dumped a whole lot of rain. In some places there was snow, but we'll get to that in a few minutes. This, of course, was a little bit concerning because there was about 60% greater than normal snowpack in the high country still. And I can tell you from our data in the mountain valleys that are filled with peat, there's still 20 to 30 centimeters of ground ice. So the potential for flood risk was really, really high. And it got people very concerned that we were going to see what happened 9 years ago, almost to the day, in 2013, where John and I were standing in the Bow River, reporting data about flood risk. So clearly we learned something about what happened in 2013 because flood risk warnings were issued instead of it happening too late. That led to the death of 4 people in High River in 2013. So conservative approach this time, which is fantastic. And the main concern was this kind of event happening. This is Cougar Creek in Calgary. And I'm sorry, I couldn't remember whose picture I used. So it's not cited, but this was happening. Houses floated down the river. So there was high concern that a large storm event would cause immense damage throughout kind of the Canmore area and into Calgary, and even Edmonton got a ton of rain too. So. All right, so in anticipation of a very large event, the response was to draw down the reservoirs all surrounding Calgary. You can see they drew down the reservoirs considerably. This is just one example that the chief hydrological and hydrodynamic engineer in Calgary likes to post. So Matt likes to post lots of information and had a very informative Twitter feed over the event, and he's still posting. There are also preliminary rainfall totals for the region. So Kananaskis got hit the hardest with rain. Some of these data are from weather stations that have telemetry. Some of the estimates are from weather watchers who are just community members who regularly report in data. So the government has amassed the data and we can see the top 26 places or stations, locations where there was the highest rainfall totals, and by far the Kananaskis region got the most rain of 218 millimeters of water. Okay, so it wasn't the 2013. There's the good news, right? It's not the same as 2013. And this is because in 2013, we also had a fairly sizable snowpack in late June, but all of the precipitation came as rain. What has happened during this event is some of the precipitation came as rain, especially in the lower elevations. But somewhere around 1900 to 2000 meters to about 2500 meters, we had the snow line varying in between there. So there's actually a lot of snow that fell in this event. I'll give you some water equivalents in a little bit here. So this is information from one of these weather watchers and pictures being uploaded into social media to share information. So we're going to take a little site tour just of the limited number of sites that we've been to. So John Pomeroy's team has been to Cox Hill and to Fortress. Fortress has been in some movies, you might have seen it before. So this is Cox Hill, 1:30 yesterday afternoon. You can see the snow machine is caught in the snow, and they had about 50 millimeters of water equivalent here, and well over 130 millimeters of precipitation total that fell during the event in this area, which is quite close to where I'm going to show you some data from my site in a minute. This next one is like big pictures. John sends the biggest pictures, right? This is Fortress Mountain. They had a little bit over 50 millimeters of snow water equivalent, and you can see students digging snow pits, and looking at water equivalency. Interestingly, over kind of the morning that we've been here, the snow line has gone up in the Rockies, so we've had a lot of melt. This was really water-laden snow that fell. So the snow line has receded up the mountain. All right, so my interest is to look at what's going on in valley bottoms filled with peat and filled with beavers, because I think beavers are super cool. So we've been working at a site, Sybil Fen, for the past 15 years or so. It's just on the southern edge of the Stoney Nakoda Nation. And it's a long time site used by their ancestors. And the interesting thing about this peatland is it has about 6.5 meters of peat at its maximum and is about 13,000 years old at its oldest point. It is chock full of beavers, so there is a lot of water storage in the region. This peatland had about 20 centimeters of ground ice in much of the area, except for where the beaver ponds are, and there is direct connection to deeper groundwaters there because there's no ground ice. And what we've seen from our past research is a decline in the water storage in beaver ponds over the winter period. So basically the beaver ponds act as windows to the shallow groundwater system, and they empty beneath the ice that forms on top of them. And so that creates significant storage capacity for any storms that might come and drop a whole lot of rain like the one that just passed. And when we looked at the 2013 data, what we discovered was that, this kind of notion that beaver ponds don't hold water during floods and beaver ponds breach or beaver dams breach during floods and increase flood risk really didn't hold true. We found that even in that massive flood, that beaver ponds can actually hold great amounts of floodwaters. So what did we kind of see on this one? Well, it's almost not exciting. So this is the peatland that we're working in now. This is just one of the, or two of the, I don't know, there's probably 40 beaver ponds in this particular area. And then you can see that they're holding water. I'll show you some pictures later on. You can see the groundwater above the water, above the surface. So this is pictures with the kind of mini drone that Jay was mentioning, or I think Mark mentioned that Jay bought a few of these mini drones that you don't need a pilot's license for. Yeah, we have a couple already. And so we kind of fly around and take a bird's eye view of what the beavers are doing. So definitely the beaver ponds have completely filled up. Some of them were quite dry before the storm event. And you can see the channel here is probably like a quarter of the water that you see. That's about the channel. So in some places we had overbank flows, but the capacity of the peat to hold back that water. This is the stream channel that runs through the peatland. And you can see most of the stream channel is not showing overbank flow, even though we had at least 100 millimeters of rain at this particular location. We don't have the exact number yet, but we know it's more than 100. And in parts of the fen, you can clearly see that the water table has risen to above the land surface. All of the ponding that you see here is quite far from the channel, and it's just water kind of sitting on top of ground frost. This is our outflow from the peatland. And here you can also see that the flooding is not flooding. The stream is contained pretty much wholly within the stream channel. And so I'll show you some data from that. So I haven't had time to convert these to discharges or anything. And clearly I can't do anything but an Excel plot in a short period of time. So just excuse that part, okay? So this channel is about, 40 centimeters or so deep at the outflow. And we saw a really rapid rise. And what we're seeing now is a rapid fall in water levels in the stream. So massive water storage in the peatland, not as much coming out of the stream, which probably accounts for the fact that we're not seeing the kinds of flow responses that were maybe the concern in the region. So this is the Jumping Pound Creek that's kind of at Highway 1. And it reached a peak. This wasn't the peak. So it reached a peak of just over 60 CMS overnight, and it is now receding already. In 2013, for comparison, it peaked at about 200 CMS, just a little bit higher than that. So I guess overall, what I want to say is, so far, it seems like we're quite lucky. The new weather report this afternoon is that another major storm is moving into the region, and it's really unclear what's going to happen. So the flood risk is not entirely past, but there was capacity for storage in the lower elevations, and in the higher elevations, the water fell as snow. So there's temporarily storage of that water. I think that's all I have. Yeah.
You've done the best. You did the best in terms of timing.
Oh, did I?
Yeah.
There we go.
You
See?
were only 11 minutes.
Never practiced. You
You
never know.
did so good. Any questions for Sherry? Carl, if you could go to that mic in the middle there so that the folks online can hear you.
Yeah, thanks. Nice talk, Sherry. If we do get a second storm, everything seems to be fairly primed right now, though, so that we don't even need a very severe storm, but we could get a lot of flooding.
I think it depends on what the temperatures are and if it's a warm rain, right? So the worst flooding, of course, will happen if we got warm rain on snow, which is what happened in 2013. And you have to have enough that it's going to melt the snow in a rapid way, right? So in 2013 in the high country, we had about a meter of snow go in like 30 hours, right? It wasn't a very long period of time. I even was texting with John about a heat dome, right? So, I mean, it would take really warm conditions for the snowpack to melt really quickly and cause the flooding. There's a ton of snow in the high country that's yet to come through. So it just depends on kind of the synchronicity of how fast it comes through and how regionally a storm might be, or how regionally expansive a storm might be, and how warm the temperatures are. So I wouldn't say we're out of the woods yet, but certainly a very interesting phenomenon to study at this point in time.
Sorry, a quick question. I'm just wondering, what is our snow budget this year in the Rockies? Lake Diefenbaker levels have been very low, super low, close to, I'm not record breaking, but it's been very low. I just wonder what's your take on this? What is happening hydrologically up there?
Yeah, at the higher elevations, it's about 60% more than normal, the climate normal. Yeah. I can't hear you, sorry.
Why South Saskatchewan river flows have been fairly low this year so far, just because of
it hasn't melted yet. Yeah, it's been a really cool spring, and the ground is frozen at the lower elevations. There haven't been very many rainstorms we're seeing like extremely low flows to many low elevations not flowing at all. And then all the snow just sitting in the high country still. Yeah.
Hi, Sherry. Thanks for the talk. I'm just wondering if you are making correlations with La Nina years. 2010 to 2012 was La Nina years, and then 2013, right? It was like the transition to Nino. Right now, we are in the second year road to Nina. So I'm wondering if you are making those correlations to maybe see in the future, if it's comparable, the data. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that was a good question. So I don't directly do that work, but John Pomeroy and Martin Clark are definitely looking at that. And I'm not sure if Yangping is also doing that kind of work, looking at the correspondence. You know, the last major flood before 2013 was 2005, which was, you know, extremely destructive. So clearly there's a cyclic situation. And it's not just in the Canadian Rockies, right? I don't know if people have heard how Northern Yellowstone is underwater with some of the highest, well, no, the highest ever by far stream flows. And so it'll be interesting to see. We do have some beaver research down there with one of my Colorado colleagues. So yeah, I think that's very tied, but some other people are doing that work. Thanks. Cool. Time to go get my kids now.
We've got a refreshment break. There's cookies back here until 3 o'clock, and then we'll get started with our final session for today.
Has really been awesome so far. It's so great to see everybody in person and to be able to reconnect. Do we have a soundtrack? Do we have any music for the reception? Oh, we do. Did you put that one song in it that I requested? Good, very good. Okay. So this session, we're going to be introducing our 2022 award winners. So congratulations in advance to everybody, and then we'll congratulate you and hear from you one at a time. So it is really a great honor to announce these 2022 award winners, and we have amazing, you know, as we've seen today, amazing students and researchers and faculty here. First award we'll give out this year is for the best master's thesis, and I'm pleased to let you know the winner is Amanda Ronquist. Amanda is supervised by Sherry Westbrook, and her thesis stands out in part because of its success in synergizing ideas and methods from the disciplines of hydrology, ecology, and fluvial geomorphology. No small feat given the breadth of the skills and the disciplinary fluency Amanda required to put together such a unique thesis, and to do so at the master's level is extremely impressive. Not only were the thesis ideas of super high quality, the illustrations were as well. I've been told that the examining committee mentioned the exemplary illustrations several times during her defense, and Amanda was awarded Best Graphics in her presentation of the thesis at the Canadian Geophysical Union student meeting held virtually in January 2021. There's one peer-reviewed publication resulting from Amanda's master's thesis research so far, and a second pending. Very impressive. Published article is in a top-tier journal, Hydrological Processes. It was an invited contribution. Amanda is now working in Calgary in the field of science communication. So we're obviously really big fans, and she's actually going to join us by Zoom to give us an update on her current work. Please join me in congratulating Amanda Ronquist on this year's Best MSc Thesis Award.
Hello. Can everybody hear me? Yes. All right, awesome. Thank you. I want to just start by thanking you so much for the award. And I'm super excited to be given the opportunity to say a few words now afterwards. And I do have just a few slides to share as I talk about where I am now after my presentation. So I'm going to hopefully get this to work. All right, is that visible? I can't see anybody right now, so. Nor can I hear anybody right now.
Yes, you're good. Thank you.
Okay, sounds good. Awesome. So I wanted to just take a quick moment also to, I know there was probably a land acknowledgement this morning, but I'm also here based out of Calgary on the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. So I just wanted to take a moment to make sure that land acknowledgement is extended to where I am now. And instead of talking about my thesis, I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about where I am now since completing my thesis. And to start, a little bit about me. So now I'm working with Fuse Consulting, as mentioned. And so I started and did both my undergrad and my master's at the U of S. So my undergrad was in environmental earth sciences, and I did my master's with Sherry Westbrook, who was just an amazing mentor. And since starting my master's, I've always been interested in science communication. And this interest came from a place of passion. I love science and I love the work I was doing. And I really wanted to be able to share that passion with other people. And I wanted people to be as excited as I was. So I'm going to take this opportunity to just share like a short story of learning to understand science from the outside perspective. And then I'll get into showing a few fun examples of the really cool projects that I get to work on now. So when I wanted to share my research, I found initially that this was really easy to do with colleagues and friends and anyone who was also part of this university research bubble that I lived in. And, you know, I could give my little elevator speech on my master's research and they would understand, they would share that excitement and ask questions. And this really made me believe that I was good at communicating my research. But whenever I found myself outside of that academic bubble, like when I went home to Manitoba, where my family is from, suddenly people seemed to not be interested or excited in what I was doing. And it took me a really long time to figure out why. So I thought maybe they don't care, maybe they don't understand why it's important or why it's exciting. And I was really getting a bit discouraged with sharing. So whenever someone would ask about what I was doing, I didn't bother with the whole elevator speech anymore. I would just throw in some super simple sentences directly to the point, simple words, no details, bare necessities to answer the question, knowing that, you know, their eyes would glaze over and the subject would change very quickly. And to my surprise, when I started doing this, suddenly people were interested. They were asking questions and they wanted to know more. And that was a really big turning point for me because it was the moment that I finally realized that I was the problem. It was me. And that delusion that I was a really good science communicator was not totally accurate. It was not that they weren't interested or that they didn't care. It was that despite all my passion and good intentions to communicate effectively, I could not see past my own knowledge. I could no longer see the outside perspective. And I wanted to share this story with you because in my experience, researchers have no idea that they talk like academics. And even when asked to put things into layman's terms, so many people think like, all right, layman's terms, I'm gonna write out digital elevation model instead of saying DM. So, and there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but it's simply the reality of research. The further into a subject you go, the things that were once new to you begin to seem like common knowledge, and your perspective shifts with increasing knowledge. And although it seems like the things that you learned in your first year biology class are common knowledge, it's not. It's just like the things that someone learned in the trades on their first day are probably unknown to a lot of the people here. There's just this huge gap between different groups of people, not only in their knowledge, but in the way they frame things, the way they use different jargon. And the more removed that these groups are from each other, the further back you need to go and the more you need to simplify. And initially, I had only simplified enough to communicate with other people who had the same undergrad or similar undergrad as I did. So, and for my master's work, I wanted to communicate more effectively, and I was a bit restricted doing that in text because we all know that the way papers are written and theses are written is very methodical. So that's where I wanted to bring in those visuals, and I turned to illustration and visual communication in order to do that. And I created the figures in design programs and made pretty maps of all my sites. And I tried to make sure my presentations were all engaging and colorful. So that journey is what brought me to my job now as a scientific illustrator. So I work for Fuse Consulting, and my job is to be that bridge over those gaps that only a few years ago I didn't know existed. So our slogan, connecting knowledge to practice. So now I take information from academics, government, practitioners, cities, nonprofit organizations, everything, and translate it into something that's understandable for whichever audience they're trying to reach. So I'm just gonna go through a few slides now of some of the really amazing projects that I've got to work on. So some of the stuff that I do is just creating infographics, and these are some for a Journal of Animal Science and Animal Frontiers, where I take a paper and I distill it into those really key messages that could actually reach an audience outside of that journal, outside of that discipline. So, and that spans any type of paper can be distilled in this way, from all the way from Journal of Animal Science to now more into restoration and drone use, and just being able to see these visuals really opens up science communication to such a wider audience and really engages people. And outside of the academic realm, I'm also working on interpretive signs, and some that are being installed in parks in Edmonton just a few weeks ago. And these ones are even more difficult because you want to cater to adults, you want to cater to academics, you want to cater to kids, and you want everybody to feel like they're involved in that knowledge sharing process. So just going through a few of these, and I've been able to work through these with a really amazing team of people, and the team is really, really important because it helps us also give that outside perspective that I've been talking about. So we always make sure to give everything to a member on the team who's never even seen it before, because it may seem counterintuitive, but your most valuable tool for communicating something effectively, something that you know a lot about, is someone who knows absolutely nothing about it. So if you want to see more of this kind of the stuff we do, we are active on Twitter. We share some Fuse Fact Fridays that come up every once in a while when our illustrators have a chance to work on some cool little tidbits of information for social media. So feel free to reach out and see some of the work we do on there. And you can also, of course, I'm also on Twitter with some of my work as well. So I just want to say thank you again, and thanks for giving me the chance to speak. I will now try to stop sharing.
Thanks, Amanda. I always thought I had nice slides until I saw yours. Tough to compete with beagles and camels and ducklings. So super nice. We're super proud of you, and I'm sure Sherry is as well. Okay, so next up is the Best Doctoral Thesis Award, and our winner this year is Dr. Magali Nahemi. Magali sends us her regards from the field. You know, she's out there with Jeff, and her other co-supervisor is Colin LaRoque. I don't know if Colin's here. I thought he was. Anyway, Magali's research, broadly speaking, focuses on processes that explain hydrological connectivity between surface water flows, groundwater, and the source of transpiration. We heard Jeff talking a little bit about this in his presentation and before we were distracted by the accordion. Who else besides me knows the name of the song that Jeff was playing? Anybody? Anybody? It's called Alley Cat. You have to be over a certain age to know that, and that's a big number. Okay, so Magali's PhD thesis proposal was awarded the AGU Horton Research Grant for Best PhD Proposal in Hydrology. Her thesis came through in spades and delivered on the promise of that $10,000 proposal award. She worked at the berm site, centered around understanding tree water use during spring onset and unpacking the relationship between snowmelt timing and transpiration phenology, along with identifying the source of that transpiration water. Magali's dedication and commitment to her project are demonstrated through her work ethic. She made measurements over a 12-month field season. If you've been up to berms, it's pretty far north. Hard-fought measurements, snowshoeing many kilometers each month through the winter and frigid temperatures to collect soil and vegetation samples for isotopic analysis. I just want to share with you that I personally spent most of that time on the couch in my family room, watching sports with a blanket over myself. Magali's other field site was in Are we all awake here? Yeah, okay. Magali's other field site was in Switzerland, where she was visiting a visiting scholar at EPFL. I won't try to say that, but it's in Lausanne, Switzerland. So it's easier to say Trent University. Anyway, Magali, we're super proud of you. Wish you were here, proud of you, and congratulations on this award. So our next award is for research excellence by technical staff, and it's my great honor to present this to Jian Liu. And we have a certificate right here, and is Jian here? So I think we're going to do a picture. Well, let me, no, let's do the picture, and let's do that. We obviously haven't done this in a long time. We're working out the bugs. So John is an agricultural researcher focused on the intersection between agricultural land management and water quality. He joined GIWS in December 2017 as a postdoc. He's now preparing for his new position as a researcher at the Norwegian Institute of Bioeconomy Research starting this summer. John was a rare and transformative hire for GIWS. And we would argue for water quality research broadly. His work has identified pragmatic options to tackle water quality challenges in the prairies and other cold regions. Through process-based insights informed by understanding of agronomy, chemistry, and hydrology, he's been able to identify crucial paths to better manage agricultural nutrients. He has aggregated leaders in the field to help support and guide broad-scale research and steps towards implementing already actionable changes through his workshop, Keeping Phosphorus on Land. This work helped us build important bridges to the agronomic community and build trust and support, key antecedent conditions to making changes that will benefit both producers and the environment. These steps were made possible by both Jian's insights, but also his humility, his talent for bringing together teams and stakeholders. Jian's work on phosphorus drawdown is some of the first truly good news we've seen in terms of options to manage water quality in the prairies in more than a decade. And we see his workshop and leadership on phosphorus management as an example of the transformative research and transformative change we at GIWS are aiming to achieve. Please help me in congratulating Dr. Jian Liu on this incredible achievement, and also to the stage to present his talk.
Okay, thanks very much, Jay, and the evaluation committee for the award. And yeah, I'm really excited for the award, and thank you so much for your nice words as well. So today I would just share with you a little bit about my pains and gains related to my agricultural water quality research in cold climates. So you may be wondering, what is agricultural water quality research about? It's actually about nutrient losses and nutrient losses from land to water. So basically, I work to quantify or understand how much nutrients transport from land to water. And so nutrient transport from land to water is affected by both source and transport factors. Source factors would include like soil, fertilizer, livestock, manure, and vegetation. And the transport factor include like snow melt and rainfall runoff. So why is this important? It's really because when there's too much nutrients in the rivers, lakes, and oceans, then there will be this so-called eutrophication problem. And this will lead to many ecological disasters, including fish kills. So when I reflect on what I have done in the prairies for the past 4.5 years, I think I really my feelings really I've evolved from the excitement to pains and to adaptation and to gains. And this make me to relate this feeling to a personal story that was shared by one of my friends from China, that he immigrated from China to Canada. And so before he came to Canada, he thought, oh, Canada is a gold country full of opportunities and fortunes. And then after spending a long winter here, then he thought, oh, Canada is cold and it's very hard to get a secured job, actually. And then he thought about how to adapt to this, how to make changes. So he started to learn English. And then after about 3 years, he was very proud to told me that he was very well settled in Vancouver with a good job, and he's becoming a citizen soon. So very similarly, my journey to the prairies started with excitement. And so when I applied and interviewed for the postdoc position with Helen and Jane 4 years ago, and I was really excited by this opportunity because I know that Canadian prairies have severe water quality problems, including Lake Winnipeg, and I knew that my research will be important and it could generate a lot of big impact. And I was also impressed by the so much land that the prairies have, and it just forms very good foundation for my research because I'm working with agriculture. I need to work on the agricultural lands. And also I was impressed by the very good reputation of GIWS, even though it is pretty young and even younger when I knew GIWS, but it was very well known from the beginning. Also, I was excited by the world's largest water project, GWF. And also, I knew that Canada is known for inclusive and supportive work environment. However, it didn't take very long for me to feel pains. And after a few months in the prairies, then I started to realize the reality. And these pains basically come from the fact that prairies is very different from what I was familiar with. And the prairies has very flat landscape, as you know, and there's little erosion. This is very good for crop production and for many other things. But for our water quality researchers, it's very challenging because when there's no soil erosion, it means the nutrient loss mainly occurs as dissolved form, which is very hard to deal with. And also it's very cold and snow stays over winter. In this photo, my daughter was wondering what to do with the swing. And the snow melts fast in the spring, and it can even cause flooding in some areas. So overall, in the prairies is really nutrient losses is dominated by snow melt processes. Is very hard to handle, and this graph just shows the long-term average stream flow and the total phosphorus load at in the Red River at Selkirk in Manitoba. Basically, again, it shows the most stream flow and the nutrient losses occur in April and May when snow melts. As a result, there are many management options that are proposed in other regions wouldn't work for water quality in the prairies. Actually, there are many agronomic and environmental trade-offs. And this practice include that are commonly used like cover crops and winter manure applications. And also, as you know, prairies face great challenge of climate change. So after feeling these pains, I started to think about adapting. And so for me, adaptation really means contextualizing and integrating obtained experience and skill set and interest in the new environment. So this involves several things. So first, I think it was understanding the new challenge and the problems, and then reflect on your skill set and experience, and then think about new potential solutions, and then in the last test the potential solutions by integrating your experience and the skill set with the available resources. So in the past, I have obtained the nutrient management and water quality research experience in Sweden, United States, and China before coming here. And also I worked with field and lab experimentation. I had a skill set about data mining, analysis, and synthesis. I'm not a modeler, but I did work with the models, and I understand how model works, and also I had a good understanding of how nutrient losses occur. So in the prairies, I tried to adapt and integrate these experiences to the resources we have. And much of my research was based on the South Tobacco Creek watershed in Manitoba. And in this watershed, my mentor, Jane, has and her colleagues started to work on this watershed since 1991. And they collected management information, including crop, tillage, fertilizer, manure, nutrient inputs, and yield. And also they did a lot of work to monitor runoff and nutrient losses at the edge of many fields. And also recently we conducted field surveys also in a number of fields to understand the soil nutrients. So using the watershed information, soil information, and the water quality information, we tried to understand how these different practices affect runoff phosphorus concentrations and volume and runoff volumes. So we did have achieved multiple gains from this watershed. So first is we better quantified the relationships between field management, soil ozone phosphorus, and runoff phosphorus. As I know that there are many people may not be familiar with the soils, but the soil ozone phosphorus is a measure of how much phosphorus is available in the soil that could be used for crops. So basically, we found that management practices could affect soil ozone phosphorus status. So, for example, the cropland with the fertilized with the phosphorus fertilizers had much higher soil ozone phosphorus than a natural grassland without any phosphorus fertilizers. However, we found that the largest soil ozone phosphorus concentration was in a cropland that received large amounts of livestock manure that contained a lot of phosphorus. And we found that soil ozone phosphorus values increased significantly with the increasing soil P balance. Also, dissolved phosphorus concentrations in both snowmelt and rainfall runoff significantly increased with the increasing soil test P values. So based on these relationships, we estimated that in many soils of the watershed and also overall in prairies, especially those fields that have received large quantities of manures, they could have a pretty large risk of phosphorus losses to water. So following that, we also verified a soil phosphorus drawdown approach to improve water quality without impacting crop yield. And this approach is actually pretty simple in theory. It's just for farmers, they can they reduce phosphorus fertilizer application rates, but continue to remove phosphorus with growing crops and harvesting crops. But this is really the first Canadian study that we believe that verified this this approach using real data. And also based on these understandings, we propose based on the findings of these studies and also the fact that soil ozone phosphorus would vary widely within fields, and then we proposed a place-based soil phosphorus management approach to achieve environmental and agronomic benefits. So we have received a funding from producers groups recently to test this approach at 6 different field sites in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. And also one thing is that we are going to work on this project with the local producers. And also in some other aspects of research, I also worked to assess crop management effects on runoff volumes. Again, this was done in this South Tobacco Creek watershed, and basically we found that when the farmers could grow bigger crop biomass, then they could reduce rainfall runoff. This is basically because when the crop biomass increase, it will increase the crop water use, and then there will be less water that is available for runoff. But on the other hand, we also realize that when there is a greater amount of straw in the winter, it can trap more snow, which is very good for agronomy purpose, because you know in the prairies is very dry. The crops would need more moisture in spring, but this on the other hand would lead to more snow melt. So this really shows that there is a trade-off for the crop residue management if we would want to keep more residue or less residue. I think this is really an area that deserve further attention. And also, I was glad that I could be involved in some work that we assessed the efficacy of different soil, nutrient, livestock, and crop management practices in the Kapor watershed to assess their efficacy in reduce nitrogen and phosphorus losses. And this work involved a lot of stakeholders in the province. So we were happy that the stakeholders could use our results in their prioritization of management options. And also, as Jay mentioned, that we had this prairie-wide workshop called "Keeping Phosphorus on the Land." And by the way, thanks for the capacity building grant from GIWS and GWF. So we had so in this workshop we brought together a number of water quality and agronomy professionals from the universities, government agencies, agriculture industry, and AGOs across the prairies, and to discuss the challenges and the potential solutions to reduce phosphorus runoff. And also, I should mention that we have been also developing a extension-focused blog, and we are delivering science-based recommendations to the stakeholders in the prairies for sustainable nutrient management and water quality protection. And also, we tried to put the prairie agricultural water quality research into a larger context of cold climate regions. For example, we conducted a cross-region comparison to understand the drivers of phosphorus losses between the prairies and the Great Lakes region. And also, we added a special issue on agricultural water quality in cold climate regions about 3 years ago, and we got a lot of contributions from Canada, United States, and Europe. And I think this was the probably the first special issue on this specific topic in literature. So in conclusion, I really think that gains will follow pains, and the big challenges and variable climate in the prairies would require more thought and more work on solutions for water quality management. Although it's not easy to identify solutions, and the trade-offs are hard to tackle, potential solutions do exist to improve agricultural water quality. For example, we need place-based and climate-based nutrient management strategies. And finally, my personal gain is that I got this permanent job in Norway, as I mentioned this morning. And last but not least, I would like I really have a lot of people to acknowledge, and especially I'm very thankful for Jay and Helen, who brought me from the US to Canada like 4 years ago, and also Jane and her colleagues started this monitoring in the South Tobacco Creek watershed in early 1990s. This work is really very unique in Canada, and I was so fortunate that I could access the data and use the data for my research. That was really helpful, and I should say that without this data, much of my research wouldn't be possible. And also, I'm very thankful for Helen, who is a great mentor and a very kind person, and who is always there to help. And also, I'm thankful for many mentors, collaborators, colleagues and friends, both at GIWS and outside. And also in the last, I would like to thank Global Water Futures, Agricultural Water Futures Project, GIWS, GWF Capacity Building Award, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada Environment and and Climate Change Canada, the government of Saskatchewan, the government of Manitoba, Ducks Unlimited Canada, Western Grains Research Foundation, and the Saskatchewan Wheat Development Commission for funding our research. And here is just a list of my prairie-related publications. In case if you are interested, just send me an email or something. I'm certainly happy to share that. And yeah, and again, thanks Jay for the award. Yeah, if there's time, I would be glad to take questions. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, thanks very much. That was a great, great presentation. And man, that food smells good, but I realize I'm thinking out loud again. Our final award is for research excellence by GIWS faculty. And it's going to be to Matt Lindsay. Where's Matt? So you can stay there. Okay. I learned from my last mistake. I'll read your introduction and then we'll come up and do a picture. So Matt's a member of the Global Institute for Water Security. He's an associate professor in the Department of Geological Sciences here at USask and the NSERC Industrial Research Chair in Mine Closure Geochemistry. His internationally recognized research focuses on improving understanding of hydrogeochemical processes that impact water security in mining environments. You get to hear a lot more about this during his talk. Since arriving at USask in 2012, it's been 10 years, buddy. Dr. Lindsay has developed a dynamic interdisciplinary research program that integrates geochemistry, hydrogeology, microbiology, and modeling to tackle water security issues in mining environments. Through a combination of research, training, and service activities, Dr. Lindsay has established himself as a leading global expert on issues of water security in mining environments. He's developed fruitful research collaborations with colleagues across Canada, in the US, Europe, South America, and Australia. These collaborations have supported several publications in high-impact international journals that have helped to grow his international stature. Dr. Lindsay has an exceptional record of graduate and undergraduate training. He currently supervises 9 MSc students, 4 PhD students, and 3 postdoctoral fellows, including a Banting postdoctoral fellow. Dr. Lindsay also supervises 4 staff members. When do you sleep? Man, that's what I want to know. Dr. Lindsay also supervises 4 staff members who, are you guys dead? I mean, what's happening out there? He supervises 4 staff members who support his research program, which has attracted over $7.5 million in external funding since 2012. Overall, Dr. Lindsay has contributed to the training of over 60 HQP who have been highly successful in securing faculty positions, postdoctoral fellowships, and in industry. Please help me in congratulating Matt Lindsay.
Well, thank you very much. This isn't going with my theme of not attracting attention to myself, but I appreciate the award. I also really appreciate the really nice I guess, biography that Dr. Ingrid Pickering wrote for me, and she is the person who nominated me as well. So today I'm going to give a talk on my research that's focused on mining, a lot on mine waste geochemistry, and really trying to understand processes that lead to contamination in mining environments and looking for solutions to try and prevent, mitigate, reclaim some of those impacts. I'm just going to say, like Sherry Westbrook mentioned earlier, my talk's probably not going to be quite as polished. I was actually preparing this in a truck driving back from Fort McMurray 2 days ago, where we were setting up some long-term reclamation experiments and deploying sensors in some pit lakes. So let's see. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is try and connect mining with UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I know some people might not see this connection or might not have thought a lot about this connection, but mining is essentially connected to every single one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals in both positive and negative ways. So if we look here on the bottom, this is where we have what we would think of as more of a negative influence on the Sustainable Development Goals, where we do need to come up with mitigation strategies. On the top is where we have mining relating in a positive way to these goals. And these are things like eliminating poverty, quality education, jobs and economic growth, renewable energy, infrastructure innovation. So we have to think about the positives and negatives. My research does often look at the negative aspects, but with the goal of trying to mitigate some of these negative impacts so that we can realize some of these positive aspects of mining in relation to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So this being about water security, we're going to talk about two things really, contamination of water resources and the consumption over use of water resources by the mining sector. This table is taken from the recent report that Jay mentioned earlier, and it just shows how water is used in the mining industry and what are the water security risks associated with that. So on the extraction side of things, water is used in extraction to get the resource out of the ore that's mined. But the waste that's generated through that process can have negative impacts on the environment, and often does. And we'll go through and I'll show some photographs. So that would be, as a waste is stored, deposited in the environment, it can react geochemically and contaminate the environment. But water is also directly used during processing as well. It's a major component of most extraction processes by the metal mining industry. This list, I would say, is a little bit short, but certainly selected hotspots of Portugal, Iran, and Canada in terms of acid mine drainage, metal leaching. I'm going to show some specific examples from Canada and from Spain, actually. And then on the processing side of it, we can have taking an extracted resource and converting it into a commodity. There's often additional processes that can involve water or even thermal conversion, hydrometallurgy to extract, say, a metal of interest of economic value. And there can be atmospheric contamination that then leads to contamination of surrounding landscapes and water. So lots of potential impacts, but again, we need to think about the fact that there are both positives and negatives in terms of sustainable development when we're thinking about mining. So I'm going to show a lot of photographs, and it looks, oh no, they're fitting on there, so that's good. So I'm going to show a lot of photographs and just talk about what we've done and what I think about some of these things. So it's more of a stream of consciousness type talk, although as I said, I was writing it in a vehicle on a highway, so it might be more like a braided stream, and hopefully it comes back at the end into something coherent. But one thing we need to think about is the reason that we mine is because we're trying to get resources or extract resources that society demands. Some of that might be, maybe some of it's unnecessary, but a lot of the resources we mine are necessary in modern society. That can be everything from copper, which is used in almost anything you can think of. But we also mine things like diamonds, which you can clearly understand are maybe not necessary to be mining. This is a photograph from the Cerro Colorado copper mine on the Iberian Pyrite Belt in Spain. This is, I took this photo when I was visiting collaborators at the University of Huelva, which is at the mouth of the Rio Tinto. And if you've if you've read or seen much on acid mine drainage, the Rio Tinto is a pretty famous place for these types of issues. The extraction of resources during mining, though, as I've already mentioned, does generate a wide range of waste materials. This photograph is nearby from the last one that I showed. This is historical mine waste. So most of this was, these mining operations started in the 1800s, 1870s roughly, and did continue through to the 1970s and have actually restarted again, some of them recently. But what you see here is a wide range of different types of waste. So let's see, I think this pointer wasn't, yeah, it doesn't work on the screen. But if we go to the top left of that photograph, you see that orange colored waste, that's cyanidation tailings, so extraction of gold using cyanide. Up here we have slag, which is produced when ore is roasted. You heat ore up to get rid of the sulfur. It makes it easier to extract the metals. This is also roasted ore. It's a different type of roasted ore. And then the railway beds are all built out of pyritic waste rock, which when it weathers can generate acid and cause acidification, but also leach metals. And most of these materials can leach metals. This is about the worst spot that you could see for this sort of problem. It's the worst spot I've seen, and I've seen a lot of them. The one thing to note, though, here is if you see this channel, it's hard to see on the screen, but there's a stream running through here, and this is the very close to the headwaters of the Rio Tinto. So the Rio Tinto is essentially being fed by this stream that's coming through this area here. So it's not surprising when we see that the Rio Tinto is quite, well, it's called the Rio Tinto for this reason. The other thing about mine waste is they come in a wide variety of physical and chemical characteristics, and also in volume. So this is a photograph from a mine in Peru. It's called the Antamina mine. These waste rock piles, dumps are about 400 meters high from the base to the top. They extend kilometers in length along the mountain. And the base of them is, I think, around 4,200 meters elevation. These are way up in the mountains. And so they're mining copper and zinc at this mine. And this is mined by a Canadian company, Tech Resources. But these very chemical and physical and chemical characteristics create a lot of challenges for both understanding potential impacts, but then mitigating them as well. So I've worked with people who have spent many years trying to model just the hydrogeology, water movement through these dumps, and they behave as dual permeability systems. And then we deal with geochemical reactions on top of that. So these are very complex systems to try and model and understand. When we think about these issues with mine wastes, with environmental impacts of mining, we often think of this term acid mine drainage, or we might hear about this term acid mine drainage. This is quite a striking example of an acid mine drainage impacted lake. This is not far away at the former Sheridan mine in Sheridan, Manitoba. And what we see here is a small lake. And if we look to the kind of off below the trees to the left, upper left there, that's a tailings beach. So tailings historically would have been pumped as a slurry out of a pipeline, and they just allowed to flow across the land and settle out. It was not uncommon that this was done into lakes. This mine was operating starting in the 1950s, I believe. And you can see that the weathering reactions, the geochemical reactions that are occurring in those tailings have caused them to go from a gray color, which they would have been at one time, to that bright orange color, which is iron minerals, iron 3 minerals. And then also acidify this lake and contribute lots of metals to this lake. And what you see here is various iron minerals that are forming as precipitates on the bottom of this lake. So I wanted to just to get a little bit of background on what's going on with acid mine drainage, because this is what I spend a lot of time on. So essentially what's happening is we have a ground up ore where the commodity of interest has been extracted. So for example, if a mine is mining, they're looking to extract zinc and nickel. They're going to extract the minerals that contain those metals, but often there's other minerals present, pyrite or minerals like pyrrhotite, that are not economically valuable, so they're deposited with the waste. Now, when you expose those type of minerals to oxygen and water, the iron and the sulfur can oxidize. It leads to acidification. These minerals are also never pure. FeS2, which is the formula for pyrite, is very misleading. There's often nickel and cobalt and copper and all kinds of things in these minerals. So the iron that comes from there can then further oxidize to form those bright orange minerals I showed in that photograph and generate more acidity, drive more acidification. Now, if we have carbonate minerals like calcite or other minerals present, it can mitigate that to some extent, but not entirely. And you see here, this little schematic shows iron and sulfate migrating down gradient in the groundwater flow system and discharging to surface water where the iron is oxidized and leading to more acidification. That's what you were seeing in that last photo that I was showing with the red along the lake bottom. And I just threw this photo in. This is a project I worked on when I was a postdoc at UBC. And it's maybe hard to make out here, but these reactions are all microbially mediated. So these are, this is a scanning electron microscope image at the surface of a sulfide mineral. And all of these little rods here are bacterial cells that are oxidizing the minerals and causing these problems. But we have to keep in mind that metal contamination isn't limited to acidic conditions. So sometimes we don't see those bright orange lakes or discharge points, but that doesn't mean we don't have issues with metals. This is the site where I did my PhD work in Alaska, where the pH of most of the pore water and drainage from this waste deposit was in the 7 to 8, pH 7 to 8 range, but they still had lots of issues with metals. And I'm not going to go through all of this, but essentially the pH, I guess, here ranges from about 6.5 to 7.5. But we can get very high concentrations of many metals. These are depth profiles of pore water and tailings, and you can see we have nickel, zinc, manganese, iron, copper, some selenium, arsenic. Like all of these things can happen at neutral pH. So we don't need to have extensive acidification to have some of these issues. And metal leaching and other related issues are not only a metal mining issue. This is a photograph of a petroleum coke deposit at an oil sands mine in Alberta, where I've done a lot of research. And there's also potential issues with metal release from this type of material here. This is a recent publication by a master's student of mine, where we were looking at the cumulative leaching of different metals under different geochemical conditions. So simulating meteoric water, the processed water that oil sands generate, and then acidic drainage like we might see, and just looking at the release over time. And what we find is the geochemical conditions matter, the pH matters, and also the release rate changes over time. So we need to understand this if we're going to try and come up with mitigation strategies to manage these impacts. I've mentioned a couple of times these iron-rich minerals that form in these mining environments. They're important because they can sequester metals. However, they're also metastable, so they're not stable. They can dissolve, they can recrystallize, and that has implications for the fate of the metals that are associated to them. And that can be a problem over time, or if we're going to implement a closure reclamation plan that may actually change the hydrology, the redox conditions. So it's not, going in and saying, oh, we'll just put a soil cover on this. Well, that could actually cause massive problems that are not really expected. This is a study with the group that I worked on in Spain. I'm just showing a couple of random pieces of work we've done where we're looking at the association of metals with different minerals. This is from that area where I was showing the photograph of the pit. That Cerro Colorado is the bigger pit there in red. And these are really thick iron mineral accumulations. And this is synchrotron X-ray fluorescence imaging, microscale X-ray fluorescence imaging, to look at the distribution of different metals on these minerals. And then the subsequent work that we did, which I'm not going to show, was looking at how that changes as these minerals are recrystallized or transformed into something else under different conditions. And not surprisingly, this creates a lot of challenges for mine reclamation. It's not as simple as saying, oh, we'll go in and put soil on this and bury it and grow plants. So we're going to go in and flood this underwater and we'll be good, because often you're going to change the conditions. It could be, like I said, it could be the pH, it could be the flux of water through the system, it could be It could be the redox conditions, and all of those things could change the association of metals with these minerals and potentially create a bigger problem than you might have had to begin with. This is a site that I've actually been gaining access to since last year through a partnership with the Saskatchewan Ministry of the Environment, where we're hoping to set up a field school for the new BSc in Environmental Geoscience program that we have in my department. And here's an example of the type of thing that happens with those recrystallization reactions. These are transmission electron microscope images. So the top left is what the minerals look like at the beginning. It's just like a very poorly crystalline clump of iron minerals. And as they react with iron 2 in this case, which is something that you will see under anoxic conditions, if you say put a soil cover on or flood the tailings, they start changing into other minerals, and you may get release of some of the metals associated with those minerals. This is it's a different problem, but it's sort of what's happening with it's similar to what's happening with the arsenic contamination in groundwater in South and Southeast Asia. However, it doesn't happen the same way with every element. So this study was specifically looking at molybdenum, and what we found is that molybdenum actually likes to be incorporated into the minerals that form instead of partitioning into the water with those reactions happen. And this work was done by a postdoc of mine, Dr. Valerie Schepfer. This paper was published last year. So I think I'm going to try and wrap it up. So my view is that we need to come up with I don't think it's just my view. We need to come up with effective mitigation and reclamation approaches. They're very critical. This is going back to that Sheridan mine, and I'm not saying this is effective reclamation, but we did a study here where we looked at tailings that had been permanently flooded under a water cover for 60+ years, and there's almost no reactions happening. It's very neutral pH, low metal concentrations, no conceivable, no major impacts. And it just shows that I'm not saying we should be putting tailings in lakes. That's not what I'm saying at all. But it shows that if you can deal with, there's ways of dealing with this that can decrease the potential impacts. And I think that the effective mitigation and reclamation is important for realizing the UN SDGs. Again, all of these items on the bottom are linkages between mining and the Sustainable Development Goals, where in order to realize them, we're going to need to come up with mitigation or remediation approaches that can help us to realize these goals. And that I'm just going to finish up here by saying, and that really includes this, the transition to clean energy technologies that we're currently going through or coming into. This diagram here shows the various clean energy technologies that are either being proposed or being implemented, developed, and the resources, the metals that are going to be required to do this. This is not, I really struggle with the word clean energy or green energy, because in reality, all we're talking about is carbon emissions. We're not talking about the other environmental impacts. And mining is required for all of these. I recently, I'll have to look up the source, but I read a report recently that said that if we're going to proceed with the clean energy transition that we've been proposing, that we could potentially need to mine more than we've ever mined in human history in the next 30 to 50 years. So think about that. We can't achieve even this one goal of clean energy transition without the resources that we need to do that. So I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing. There's obviously issues with mining, but my question is, the question that I think about most of the time with my work is, how do we balance resource extraction, water security, and here in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. This is a photograph some of you may have seen. I think it was in one of the images of research from many years ago, but this is showing a stream that's not very impacted by mining, coming down here, and drainage from a tailings impoundment flowing into it, and there's a pH transition and a series of different geochemical reactions that are pH dependent occurring that's producing these precipitates. And I just want to add this here because I kind of get frustrated in general. There's significant research, training, and engagement needs and opportunities in this area. And in my department, we're down to me. I'm the only person doing this work now. There's huge amounts of funding available, so many opportunities, and there doesn't seem to be really much interest in expanding in this area for whatever reason. Hopefully I've convinced you that it would be an important area to expand into more. And I just want to finish by acknowledging, I've only listed people here who I've showed papers that we've published together. But of course, as Jay mentioned, I've had a lot of people work in my group, a lot of other collaborators too. So I want to acknowledge all of them. And again, thank you very much for the award.
That was great, Matt. Thanks so much. Really an eye opener and, you know, compelling images, you know, beautiful at the same time, but really disturbing. So on that happy note, I'd like to, first of all, congratulate all of our award winners again. It was great to hear from you and keep on doing the great work that you do. And that goes for everybody here today. It was just amazing to bring everyone back together again. I mentioned at the beginning of the day that we haven't been together in this room since December or maybe even November, whatever the date was of our Christmas party in 2019. So that's, you know, 2.5 years. So great to see everybody in person. And now it's a wonderful day. Let's thank our organizers. So Mark Ferguson worked really hard. Michelle Martel-Andre worked very hard. I'm not sure who else worked really hard. Andrea Rowe worked really hard. Anyone else? Jesse, Widow, Viviana. So let's have a round of applause for our organizers. And now we've come to well, it's not the most important part of the day, but it is an important part of the day. It's time for our reception, and we have food behind me, and we have drink tickets with Michelle. And I guess, so are they ready for us here in the back? Because I don't see anybody back there. But the food is ready. Food is ready. The bar will be ready soon. Michelle has the drinks. Thanks everyone again for a fantastic day. Great to see you.